Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Brussels. Welcome to the European Values Conference. On behalf of Inge, Ruud, and Kita, the organizing committee, we would like to thank you and invite you to this three-day conference. It has been a long looking forward to this conference. We've been busy for quite some months preparing this conference. We're really happy that you're here. And of course, the date of today, May 9, is quite symbolical. It's not a date that we chosen out of nowhere. Today is Europe Day. If you walk around in Brussels, if you visit Monica Piss, for instance, you can see that he's really well dressed in European colors, really nice and blue, with some yellow stars. And today is also a really good day, a Europe Day, to present a project that we've been working on for actually several decades. With Luc Halman here present, we're going to celebrate tomorrow because he's also saying farewell to Tilburg University. He's been chairing the European Value Study for quite some decades, and he's also one of the co-authors of the Atlas of European Values that we'll be presenting today, in front of that we're going to present to the representative of the Netherlands to the European Union, Mr. Robert de Groot. It are turbulent times, right? I mean, the tagline of the Atlas is change and continuity in turbulent times. And I think the title was actually chosen before the turmoil in the eastern part of Europe is taking place today. But yeah, it are turbulent times that we're dealing with, and that we're also going to discuss, I think, in the conference for the next few days. Another line of the conference is that we're looking to the past, to the present, and to the future. The past is indeed the Atlas will be consisting of several maps, several charts that document values change or value stability, going to document similarities or differences between European countries in their values, in what people actually find important. Don't forget the Atlas of European Values, it originates from the European Value Study, a longitudinal project that traces back to 1980s, which actually documents on several domains what people find important, how people are oriented to each other, how they're oriented to politics, immigrants, solidarity, and so forth. So it really gives a good snapshot of what's going on today, but also about what's actually taking place, what took place in the past, and maybe also where we're looking, where we're heading forward to. So in the second part of today's session, we'll also having a debate, a plenary debate, where we're going to interact with policymakers. Member of European Parliament, Tom Berendsen from the CDA will be among us. And we're going to ask him, other panelists like Mario Scharpelig and Kita Muis, well, what in the Atlas do they find interesting? But also we're going to interact with ongoing debates about what's the meaning of the Atlas for policymakers, what can policymakers do, how they do today take into account values, public opinion, and so forth. But today, May 9th, also actually presents, or we would like to present, we want to kick off the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence of European Values. You can already see some banners here behind me. In the center, the Jean Monnet Center, we're going to bring together research and teaching at Tilburg University that deals with European topics. We're happy that Harald Benning is here, who's an expert on the finance part of the European Union. Also, Monique van Dijk-Groeneboer is among us. She's one of the leaders of also of one of the 6 teams that we're actually going to discuss in the years ahead. And because the Jean Monnet Center, it works on the 6 themes that the present European Commission, presided by Ursula von der Leyen, had the 6 themes that she put forward, including a stronger Europe, a Europe that works for all, and also digitalization, a new Green Deal. And all these 6 topics we're going to discuss in the years ahead, together with linking pins, people like Harald, Monique, and other people working at Tilburg University, working on this topic. At this point, I would like to already thank 2 people before I'm going to open the floor. And the 2 people that I would like to thank first is Rob van Eikeren. Thank you very much for opening your house, for having this event taking place in the center of Brussels. For us, it's really symbolical, really important that we launch this atlas, that we present this atlas in the center of European of political decision making. So really thank you for opening up your house to us, and yeah, we're going to make it a really nice and wonderful event today. And the second person I would like to thank is Rector Magnificus Wim van de Donk for your strong support for the European Atlas, as well as the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. And we all do know from the last months, actually, that yeah, you have a big heart for the European Value Study. And I think it's also then appropriate that yeah, you also hand out, together with us, the first edition of the Atlas to the representative, Mr. De Groot, later. But maybe you'd also like to yeah, say a few words of welcome to the people over here, and also the people watching via YouTube. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Tim. I'm more than happy and willing, actually honored to do so, in first of all joining you in the great thanks to Rob van Eycker and his team, out of the Dutch provinces, in the midst of the European quartier here in Brussels. I think, you know, it's very important to, although you have the conference the next days in Tilburg, to start here, where it very well started. The 9th of May, Schuman, we all know the history, but started it with values or with coal and steel. I was thinking these days when these poor soldiers and citizens that are hiding in a steel factory, coal and steel, again, I think, you know, they were so brilliant, these leaders that started Europe, in seeing where to start is, you know, overcoming that terrible past. And it's a little funny to say that these days, because we promised each other never again, and there we are again. War, atrocities, an outright insultation of what human values and human dignity should be, and in the core of our European continent. I always immediately say there were wars all over the world, of course, all these days. We should never forget that. But one way or another, this one, very near to us, is provoking severe thoughts these days that we have indeed the 9th of May, a day of Europe. It cannot be a coincidence that the people in Ukraine, many of our students are from Ukraine, and we are admiring these young people that indeed are not talking about coal and steel, but about values. That this war, again, is about human dignity, freedom, the values that we should strive for. In a way, the coal and steel was an intelligent political maneuver to start a Europe that should rebuild and to reconcile after the war. We did a magnificent job, although I would say the last decades it was especially organizing a market, which is not unimportant, but we should never forget that it is much more than a market, a community of people that want to strive for good lives, to taking care for each other in a continent that has so much responsibility for what in the rest of the world, after all these years, has to be organized. Freedom, dignity, rule of law, democracy, rechtsstaat, and that indeed is more than coal and steel. It's about values. It's about what some would describe as the soul of Europe. And Monique, it's your dean from the School of Catholic Theology that once said to me, you know, what is a soul? It's a complex thing, you know, you cannot see it, you cannot grasp it. He said, well, the soul, actually, you could describe that as something that you want to keep for eternity, which is a kind of intriguing working definition. And I think values, and the values that, of course, change and are subject to a rigorous scientific research in how Europe is evolving, also in this part of the adventure, this edition of the Atlas show that there is also indeed a glimpse of eternity. What people really think is important to strive for. What people really think is, you know, giving an outlook of a just and a society that is also sustainable, not only in the ecological sense, but also in the social sense. So we are very proud as a university. That's where I end, Tim, with a big thank you so much again, because you have done a wonderful job. I already had the honor to have a glimpse of the PDF of the Atlas and many things that will be presented the next days during the conference. But there we are again, an excellent group of researchers that has really invested in the long-term, I would say, foundations of Europe. And that's, I think, our message to the Commission also these days, that we know that many research is granted with great grants, and there is a lot of money reserved again in all kind of programs to foster knowledge and innovation. And sometimes, I must say, I'm a fan of technology, don't hesitate any minute about that, but the balance should be there. It cannot be true that we have, within a few years from now, a technologically hyper-advanced Europe that has socially been, you know, backward, and that we have not have the knowledge that we need to keep up that kind of value approach to what really is that society that we are striving for. That's the big why of Europe. And of course, again, technology is indeed also from a value point itself very intriguing as a concept, and we should invest a lot of money in that. But don't forget the humanities. Don't forget the social sciences. Don't forget all these scholars that contribute, perhaps even more importantly, to our knowledge and thinking about the future of Europe. And in this concept, values are key and crucial. That is very again shown by the wonderful work that you've done. So on behalf of our university community, Tim, and all your colleagues, we are very proud actually that you again succeeded in doing so. The Jean Monnet Center is still another branch at this already impressive tradition of the European Value Studies community. And we are just looking so forward to what is presented today here this afternoon in Brussels, but especially also the next days in Tilburg at the university and all the events that will come, because this is just the opening. The book will be presented, will be discussed, but there is so many results, so much results that have to be discussed later on, that this will, I promise you, not the latest meeting that we are together. And a special word of welcome to Luc, because I know you will be retiring, which is a kind of funny idea. Luc is going away. it's Mr. EVS, but you're sure we will have some moments for you to say thank you, but a very special welcome also for you here in Brussels. Tim, that must be it. Thank you.
So thank you, Wim. Indeed, as you also already repeated, you saw the Atlas of European Values already in PDF format. And yes, there is the formal presentation of the Atlas later today. But for those of you actually tuning in online, maybe it's already interesting to say that the Atlas can already be consulted in PDF via the Atlas. Yeah, Monique, take your phone. It can be consulted online. Via the website valuesatlas.eu, not the other one, not Atlas of European Values, because that's a different project, but indeed valuesatlas.eu. We're going to continue with a few words by Ruud Luijks, the chair of the Executive Committee of the European Value Study. Ruud, I'll give you the floor.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. It is an honor to speak to you for a couple of minutes on this great, exciting, but also maybe threatening day. Today, it's Europe Day, and in Strasbourg, the President of France, as acting President of the European Council, will present his agenda on the conference on the future of Europe. More than 2,000 kilometers from here, in Moscow today, Victory Day is celebrated to remember the victory over Nazi Germany 77 years ago. But with the war in Ukraine going on, this got another context. Today, here in the Huis van de Nederlandse Provincies, the third Atlas of European Values will be presented by the authors, Luc Halman, Tim Reeskens, Inge Siebe and Marco van Zundert, In the title it states change and continuity in turbulent times. And that is what this time, like many times, is. The initiative to make this atlas was made by Luc Hallman, my predecessor in the executive committee, who was involved in EVS since the early 1980s. And it is a contribution of the Dutch EVS team to the EVS project. As said, it's the third one. In 2005, the first atlas was published using EVS data of 1999, and in 2011, the second atlas was subtitled Trends and Traditions at the Turn of the Century, based on the EVS data up to the fourth wave in 2008. The European Value Study is a European project striving to include as many European countries as possible. EVS started at the end of the 1970s, at a time when European integration was intensifying. A group of scholars witnessed at that time a gradual decline in the dominance of Christianity. This led to some substantive questions. Do Europeans share common values? Are values changing in Europe, and if so, in what directions? Do Christian values continue to permeate European life and culture? Is a coherent alternative meaning system replacing Christianity? What are the implications of these developments for the European Union, European unity? And that was in the end of the 1970s. I'm not going to present the whole history of the European Value Study, but will highlight a couple of moments. The initiative started at the universities of Leuven and Tilburg by professors Jan Kerkhoffs and Ruud de Moor. The first survey was held in 1981 in all European community members except Greece, but including Spain. A couple of years later, more European countries and Canada and the US were surveyed as well. The follow-up survey was held in the 1990. The late 1980s was another exciting period in European history, with the fall of the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall. This gave the opportunity to extend the geographical coverage of the project to Central and Eastern Europe, to in total 27 countries. A close cooperation with Ron Ingelhard, who died yesterday a year ago, led to surveys outside Europe and to the birth of the World Value Survey in the mid-1990s. The third wave was held in 1999 and included 33 countries, and topics included now also solidarity, social capital, democracy and work ethics. On the basis of these data, a first Atlas of European Values was created. The fourth wave in 2008 was when it comes to coverage the most successful. 47 countries or regions were part of it. Now, having already data for 30 years, yielded the opportunity not only to compare countries, but also to analyze change over time. The most recent wave started in 2017 and is finished now, and almost all data are available for analysis. Almost 40 countries are surveyed. A close cooperation with the World Value Survey makes it that data for 80 countries are available worldwide, making global comparisons possible. European Value Study is one of the important studies in Europe on values and attitudes, together with the European Social Survey that started fieldwork in 2002. Running a cross-national survey needs a good organization, and to make it truly comparable, several aspects are important. We need good samples to generalize to the population. This includes weights to correct. And we would benefit from a better access to sampling frames maintained by the National Statistical Institutes. Translation is pivotal. Bad translations lead to incomparable data. Comparable translations between surveys would enhance the quality of cross-national surveys. Harmonization of cross-national measurements within and between surveys like education, income categories, political parties, religion, occupation is another important quality criterion. Have good documentation in place that make your data easily accessible for users is important, and in the context of CESDA, the Consortium of European Social Science Data Archives, a lot is already achieved. This brings me to the last point that I would like to shortly address, the future of social surveys. Traditionally, good representative surveys are conducted face-to-face. Recent times, self-administered surveys like web surveys are becoming more fashionable, one reason being the extreme high cost of face-to-face interviews. EVS has taken up the challenge in the last survey round and is cooperating with other European surveys like ESS and SHARE to prepare the transition to mixed modes in the coming decade. Cooperation with other surveys is pivotal to create a good European and global research infrastructure. Cooperation within European projects and frameworks funded in the context of Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe, like CERES, Synergies for Europe's Research Infrastructures in the Social Sciences, and SHOC, Social Sciences and Humanities Open Cloud, and Europe Open Science Cloud. Increase of the impact of EVS and other comparative surveys for policy and politics is very important. The Atlas to be presented today is a great example of this, but also eValue, a project that makes EVS data available online to be used in secondary education. The COVID-19 pandemic also made us more aware that in case of emergencies, you need a flexible infrastructure to go into the field when necessary. A well-functioning web panel, European web panel, that can be used by the social surveys would be a way to go. I hope I didn't bore you too much with this overview, but to make an atlas, you need good data. And the European Value Study provides these since 1981 and will do so in the future. Important, of course, is to raise the funds for the next round that will be due in 2026. This might be a standalone, mixed mode survey or a close cooperation with the other European and global surveys. Today's presentations will show how important a sustainable project as the European Value Study is to understand the world of European values.
Thank you, Ruud. Indeed, the European Value Study is a valuable source of information about what people find important, what drives people. And we also think, and we do know that, that also policymakers actually use them. And also the aim of the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence in the years to come is indeed to untangle the link between values, public opinion, and policy on complex issues, including migration, sustainability, so climate change, topics that we're currently dealing with and are not easy, and they really transcend national borders. And the past few years, the Joint Research Center of the European Commission has been working on topics of values and identities, and these days it's working on new reports on meaningful and ethical communications. And people involved in European Value Study, including Luc Hallman and Frédéric Gontier, they have contributed to the report Values and Identities. And so today we have among us Mario Scharfbillig of the Joint Research Center of the European Commission to present the report that was drafted by many colleagues all over Europe. And we would like to welcome Mario to present the report. You can use the lantern over there. And the slides should be in consecutive order.
Oh, yeah. Wonderful. So that works as well. Wonderful. Thank you very much for inviting me, first of all, to Tim and the organizers, and to also giving us such a prominent position on your agenda today. So I'm very thankful for this. And you see here the report. It's called Values and Identities, a policymaker's guide, because for us, the focus here was really to try to bring this home to those colleagues in the Commission and the EU in general who work on this every day and need to design policies that rely on the understanding of what values are. And yeah, again, thank you also to Luc and to Frédéric, who helped us a lot in designing this and figuring out what the hell is values actually. Because while we, of course, all have some intuitive understanding, yeah, values, good things, things that guide us to some degree, the science is not as agreeing with each other of what exactly it is. And so we had spent quite a few months of sorting through all the literature, all the understanding of all the things that have been written about it, to then present something that hopefully makes sense. And I hear in the slide, I mean, we are facing lots of challenges today. And I chose to not present any images of the war. We've heard talk about this already. It's dire situation, but at the same time, it's not the only thing that we are facing. We are facing climate change. We're facing loss of biodiversity. We have lots of high levels of inequality that seem to tear our societies apart. And we have the war. And all these challenges are surrounded nowadays by high levels of polarization, by lots of misinformation, disinformation campaigns. And the question was, how can we make sense of that? And how can we design policies within that situation that really address it while also not furthering polarization in our societies? And that's really what our starting point was in this project. But yeah, we heard it, we didn't work alone. So this is not a report from the JRC for everyone else. It's a report where we gathered the expertise and integrated the expertise of many good scholars and great scholars in different fields. We had Luc, we had Fred, we had also economists, philosophers, theologists in the expert group, and overall 30 experts with whom we worked and tried to make sense of this from an interdisciplinary perspective, to really have a great overview of the science, where it stands or where it stood until November last year. We will see more research in the coming years from you on the EVS data that will continually be available to everyone else. And so we really think we did the effort of trying to summarize this to a degree that we can be certain of at this moment. Again, I mean, I said what we have as challenges in front of us, but at the same time, we also have the issue that policymakers in general, but also scientists, should care about this more deeply. Because while we have democracies where we have parties that we can elect for whatever program they're presenting, they then can decide this is the right way forward, and if the citizens don't agree, they can just vote for someone else, at least a few years later. We saw in the US in the past, where it was in the extreme, that citizens do not seem to accept a certain democratic change of leadership anymore, because to them at least it felt as if something was so fundamentally wrong in their perspective that they wanted to overturn election results. And we've seen it in the US, but if we look into the evidence on polarization, depending on which survey, which study we look at, the levels of polarization in the US is not exceptional. And we see in Europe, several countries on similar or even higher levels of polarization, meaning that the events we saw on Capitol Hill could easily happen in Europe as well. And therefore, it's not only the job of some politicians to think about it, it's actually the job of everyone, all policymakers who design policies and scientists to also understand this, what leads to citizens being so riled up or having such a clash of opinion that they were willing to overcome democratic institutions because they feel it's much more important to them to get their candidates elected. While I talk to many scientists here, and we agree to the degree that values are important in the science, I here have one snapshot of news articles and leading European newspapers that shows it's not only something that we talk about in journals, we talk about in scientific journals that perhaps scientists read, but it's also something that's basically everywhere. Values are mentioned, especially around elections, by all politicians, and importantly, by all kinds of politicians, on all sides, on the left, on the right, on extremes. And we see here that it's not that one side would say, we are standing up for the values, we are the values, and the other side would say, yeah, we are against values. Values are bad, we don't want them. But usually, you see, everyone saying that they are standing up for the shared values. They are standing up for the good values. And that should give us pause and thinking, well, if we always say we are standing up for our values and everyone says this, is this then meaningless? Well, certainly not. But it means that people have different understanding of values and still think that if they are standing up for those, they're doing the right thing, they're doing the good thing. And therefore, we need to understand this better, what this means. And that brings us to the politics of today, where, of course, politicians can use that either for good, but also to divide us further, where we see also empirically that we have moved away from a politics that is purely based around economics, economic issues, redistribution in society, towards a new politics where we have multiple conflict lines. We have the economic conflict line still there, it's not gone away, but we also have a cultural or social conflict now on top of this, where it's about LGBT rights, homosexuality, identity, ethnicity, gender roles. And this makes it more complicated nowadays to present policies, to have people unified behind something, and to really identify themselves with parties. And some scholars, among EVS scholars, would even say, well, there might even be a third conflict line, the populist conflict line, that goes on top of this, so either being social or economic. And that means for every policy we propose, or the Commission is proposing, or the EU is proposing, there are more ways nowadays to see this and to agree and to disagree with it. That makes it much harder. We see here, that was just for the scientists who then ask me, is there even data behind this, or is this just talk? No. We see the studies that show, yeah, okay, the cultural dimension wasn't really that prominent after the Second World War, but it seems to have, at least until 2010, overtaken the economic dimension. And, well, now the question is this still the case? Certainly both dimensions matter. But there's another important factor to this, and that is something has changed, namely that it seems nowadays that the, let's say, elites, so those with high levels of education, seem to have changed their political orientation over the last decades. This is a larger study from Gethin et al., Piketty, one of the co-authors, who showed, looking at all political manifestos over the last decades in, I think this is 21 different democracies in the West, that whereas in the 1950s, those with high levels of education were voting more right on average, nowadays it's actually turning towards more left. And we cannot definitively prove what is the causal relation here. Is it the cultural dimension that drives this change, or is it the other way around, or is it just, yeah, it's happening at the same time? But this shows us something, and especially people who work in the EU, highly educated usually, should be aware that something has changed over time. And the final point to this, why we should care, is, and that is something that's very important to us in the JRC, and the JRC as the knowledge service of the European Commission, where we also always want to stand up for evidence-informed policymaking, trying to get more evidence into better policies, because we believe that fundamentally if science is involved and gives us the right facts, that policies then are better. We have the my-side bias. Others would call it confirmation bias, depending on definitions, that shows that, well, when we are convinced of something, and something is very important to us, then that's also clouding or driving our perception of the facts itself. And so if something comes up that's in line with our perception or convictions, then we are more easily likely to believe it and also, well, share it further with our networks. And that means that where we think sometimes we are fighting about the facts, we're actually fighting about the values, but we're not saying that. Or we're not even thinking about it ourselves, because we think, well, we are right, here this evidence supports me, and, well, is it really? And that's very difficult, because this my-side bias has been shown to not be mitigated by intelligence, nor political sophistication or actively open-minded thinking, meaning that no matter how smart we are, no matter how much we know, we're still subject to this bias. And that means, yeah, it's a central challenge in general for policymaking, and especially evidence-informed policymaking, on all sides. It's not just this one political side that is, yeah, guilty of this. It's everywhere, potentially to differing degrees, but it is there. And so our conclusion from all of this evidence already is we need to understand values better. We need to know what values are and how they relate to each other. And therefore, yeah, in the report, we go deeper into values model. After consulting the experts, we chose one specific values model, the personal values model, as a good heuristic, as a good education device to learn about them. I know the scholars around this this crowd here is working a bit more with social values, which is something related, but we think it has enough overlap to learn from this already what people want. And the core to this is this general orientation towards, let's say these 2 dimensions I mentioned before, we can call them into, or name them through the values terms. So the openness to change values, that people cherish, being independent, exploring things, making their own choices, which seems to conflict to some degree with the values on conservation, where it's all about the group cohesion, security, traditions, and caring about the in-group. And the other dimension is this self-transcendence, where it's caring about others, equality, close ones, but also nature, which seems to conflict to some degree with self-enhancement values, about seeking pleasure, fun, but also wealth and self-esteem. And so we can understand many conflicts through this lens already, and understanding these values are everywhere to some degree, but people have different priorities over those. We designed an infographic out of those, and I only go into the last point here because there's the link to the Values Atlas that we hear more about later on. Namely that if we go all the way from the left, which is kind of this core of value orientation, okay, you have this diversity, all the way to the big picture. You know, what does it mean in detail? What are the attitudes towards very specific issues? That is where the Atlas comes in and gives us a great overview of a lot of different attitudes that we can then look into detail and look at country by country. And this is, of course, too much to put it on one infographic. That's why it's 100 pages. But we tried at least to give some orientation. And I think it's a complementary work here to know, okay, this is diversity on the one hand, on the personal level, but of course there's more going on, and in different countries it might play out differently. Finally, these are my key arguments usually I give why values matter as well. Might be relevant then for the others as well. And that is what we find usually is that values are kind of a blend of individual and biological histories, meaning that they are very stable, and that they are especially stable later on in life. They're not easy to change. So whenever people ask me, like, we just need to change people's values and then everything is good. It's like, yeah, it's not that easy. It doesn't work that way. While values change, they do change, especially they change cohort-wise. So the new generations replacing older ones, and then values change. But people also like their values a lot. They find them, they're positive towards them. And if you ask them, do you want to change your values? They're like, no, these are my values. They're perfect, they're good. And that is in contrast, for example, to personality research. When you ask them, do you want to change your personality? And people are like, yeah, I think I'm too much this or too much that. But yeah, on values, they're perfectly fine with them. And that's why this different priorities over values matter so much. Because, yeah, we think they're right. We are right. This is our perspective, and they should be taken into account. And to some degree, we agree. And the final point, and here, I guess there's some debate to be had among the scientific side at the moment. At least I've seen some papers debating this. But usually the finding is that there's more diversity within country than between countries. So even while we do have differences between Western European countries, Southern European countries, and Eastern European countries, we see usually within each country we have this diversity. So no matter where we're making policy, if it's on EU level, on member state level, we need to think about this. We need to be able to think about polarization around certain issues and take other values into account. This here is one slide. It's an empirical finding on where do the EU values fit in. And here I'm talking about the EU values in terms of Article 2, the democracy, rule of law, freedom, that we have also asked in a recent Eurobarometer to all EU countries, and where we then did a empirical clustering, where does what fit, and we clearly see that EU values are very close to universalism values. So where I said self-transcendence, caring about others, nature, that's where agreement with EU values comes in. And it's further away from values around, power, resources, like self-enhancement, wanting to be recognized in society, but also a little bit further away from values such as tradition or conformity. That's something we can, of course, take home and discuss further, but that was just a snapshot of the empirical work we've done there. So if we think about EU values and who agrees with them, that's the corner where we are. And if we want to convince others, then we need to connect the EU values close to the other values that are perhaps further away from them. Finally, as a content part, it's called Values and Identities, and that has a reason. It's because we also have identity politics going on that contribute to polarization around values. So there's a deep connection there. And one thing that we find from social psychology very well established is that we all are in need of group identities. You know, it's important to us to belong to someone, and we will see this later on. And I think in the first graph that I chose to talk about on the Values Atlas, it's people find it important who they belong to, and it's human nature. It has been for a long time. At the same time, our identities are multiple, meaning we can switch our identities. It's not only one natural one that we are given, but our nationality, our gender, our age, our work group, our interests, all can become our identities. And there's even evidence that this is really quick. Just mentioning certain other identities that makes this salient in us switches our understanding and switches the way we behave due to the norms that we associate with these groups. And that's something that's going on a lot in social media, where different identities are triggered, and then it's like you think through that lens. And it's a problem and also benefit, because on the one hand, identities are great in leading to cooperation among those belonging to a group. If we mention the EU identity or European identity, it's good, because then we feel we all belong together and we are willing to sacrifice our own benefits for the sake of the group. But at the same time, it doesn't have to, but it can lead to out-group discrimination. Because then if someone is not belonging to that group, we see them as less deserving and even less knowledgeable, less clever. And therefore, just because of that, disregarding whatever they might tell us about any policy or any value. And the one thing in the infographic that we could go into more detail is the link between values and identities, at least on the personal values level. Meaning those people who care a lot about conservation values, they also care more about the in-group dimension. They care more about what my group says and how my group is perceived by others. Whereas, for example, those high on openness to change are somewhat independent of groups, or want to be seen as independent of groups at least, and therefore don't care so much about the opinion of others. And that means we have this direct link of values to identities, and depending on where we are born, then which identities matter. So I could have exactly the same values, but if I'm born across the border of a certain country, then I might see the others as my enemy or my friends, depending. And so we summarized a number of identities in the reports. Among the most important ones, the local identity. So we asked again in the Eurobarometer, what are the most important identities to you? And the top most important identity was the family identity. So that's the closest group for us and the most important one everywhere. But on average, in the EU, national identity was the second most important one. And we shouldn't forget this, that this is, even if they also have a European identity, national identity is extremely important to many, many people. But there are also other ones. We see organizational identity, for example, around parties, extremely important in the US nowadays. So being Republican and Democrat has taken up so much thought space in the US that it drives a lot of the attitudes and opinions there. And in Europe, we have some countries where it's similar. So we shouldn't think, again, it's only the US. And so summarizing values and identities into polarization and why it matters, where we care, why should we care, is that on the issue polarization side, that's one type of polarization, and the affective polarization type is the other type. Issue polarization is disagreeing on content. It's disagreeing on what is the right policy forward. What should we do? And we would say this is actually somewhat of a good polarization, because it tells us that people care. People care about what we do in politics, but they have different visions of what we want to do. And with those types of polarization, we need to engage. We need to ask people, okay, why do you disagree? What is the reason behind this, and what is the right way forward you want? And we're going to talk about some ways to do this. The other one, though, is the affective polarization side. That is where it's all about hating the outgroup, just disliking the other part. And you see here, this is a poster from the recent German election, so my home country, where it says, hang the Greens. And that was just, it shows you, it's not about content. They don't care about any content decision. They care about hating the other side. And that shows you, if you have high affective polarization, that is something we need to battle no matter what. Because there it's not disagreeing on content, it's just hating the other side, and that's not compatible with our understanding of democracy. And so differentiating between those dimensions is sometimes hard. And in social media, don't even try. But yeah, you need to engage with citizens to understand, is it really driven by they don't like this person, or is it driven by because they have a fundamental different view of where we should go? And so in the final part of the report, what we propose are several tools, toolbox, as we call it, on how does this matter for the policy-making process. So we're not suggesting any policies. We're not saying you need to raise taxes or do more on climate. We're asking about how can we make our policy-making process in the EU or in the member states robust so that they are not overcome by polarization levels and therefore democracy itself is at stake. I don't talk about all of those. Here's an overview of those. But certainly an important one is citizen engagement and deliberative democracy processes, which we have seen and which will conclude at the moment with the Conference on the Future of Europe, where citizens from all over Europe can and were able to talk about their vision for the future of Europe in many different areas. And you can, of course, use these processes not only on defining the great grand vision for the EU, but also on individual policy files. If you want to know what people already see, what their issues are, creating a safe space for them to express themselves in such a deliberative process then actually allows you and allows them to see the other side as human, as just wanting something slightly different and then agreeing with each other. That's an important process. And another one that we are still working on, and where Tim will also consult us in the future, is this meaningful and ethical communication, namely communicating using value frames, which is a recommendation in the literature that we should do this, especially framing in the values of those who disagree with that attitude to convince them. But the question is, of course, should we always do this? Is this ethical? Is this right to do? If it's not in line with the policy, we would argue not. And therefore, we are going to come up with another report on this where this explores this in more detail. And so, yeah, basically what I presented to you was the Values and Identities report you see published in November, but it's part of a greater series of reports that we work on. The first one was in 2019 on understanding our political nature, where we gave an overview of all things that matter that are beyond the pure rationality perspective. As emotions, trust, values, identities, frames, narratives, all of that's what matters apart from being purely about the facts. The second one in October last year was about technology and democracy. Oh, no, even 2020. Time flies by in COVID times, I see. Well, it was all about how does the new technological environment that we are in, algorithms, social media, all these new processes, how do they change our way to interact with each other? How do they change our democracy? And also, the way we interact with facts, with knowledge, with evidence, with if there's something like truth. And then, the next project, Meaningful Ethical Communication, likely to be out around this time next year. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention. And good luck with the next editions of the Values Atlas. And I'm looking forward to the discussion around it. Thank you.
So maybe there are some questions for the audience, from the audience on this. Any questions? Okay, maybe I then ask a question to you. So you talked about the fact that people that embrace these that conservation values, they're closely related to strongly identifying your own national identity, feeling comfortable with the in-group. Yep. But at the same time, you actually showed that these the European values that are being carried out are actually universalist. We do know actually that people weakly identify with Europe. Mm-hmm. Would it then be like a strategy for Europe if they want to have more people actually identifying with Europe? Maybe there are some values that may be conflict with what people maybe want. So how do you actually reconcile this?
First of all, it's the question of do they identify with Europe or with the EU? And of course, there's already an important distinction not every country in Europe is in the EU. That's the first thing. So can they even legitimately identify themselves with that? And we also saw it in the atlas that people in Norway were actually identifying a lot with Europe. Doesn't mean that they identify with the EU. But certainly for the EU, the question is, what are the priorities? And we heard it by Ruud in the talk. Was it based on coal and steel, or was it based on the values that we want to represent? And I mean, I'm not representing the policy position. I'm here as a researcher talking about this. But certainly, if we want the values as to be the core of the identification with the EU, then we, of course, at the same time need to make citizens who are not so much agreeing or in line with this perspective to understand how democracy and rule of law can serve their own perspective of the values, if it can. Because this is always the important point that we also say around communication. If they have legitimate questioning that, for example, they want democracy but it doesn't deliver for them, we need to understand why. Why do they feel this way? And then we need to work on that, and then we can build on that success and communicate this better. So that's, I think, one way to reconcile this.
Okay. Some more questions, Monique? Yes.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. It was so condensed. I'm really sort of blurred all together. So I'm sorry for that I don't have that clear question. But thank you so much for what you shared with us, and I'm looking forward to read it because I hadn't read it before. So I'm happy to know about it. The thing that one of the many things that struck me, for instance, were you say every cohort there may be changes in values. And that's very hopeful, I think. I'm always very hopeful, as people know me. So I was thinking also, considering this COVID pandemic we're in, and young people now being raised up with a completely unsecure lifestyle, no expectations whatsoever, not even from their country, and being safe in Europe, as we figured we were, something like that. Do you have any idea that this cohort may make a huge gap to a new positive, not personal, inner group-oriented way, but how can we rule this world together? Something like that. It's more of a wish than you probably know the answer, but that was figuring me. So I'm looking forward to your reaction there.
Thanks for the question. And normally I would put the link to the report in the chat. It's a bit difficult here now.
Do, yeah.
But I certainly will do that, expose and have some physical copies of the report. On the young generation, of course, there's a lot unknown how this will go, because on the one hand, in many of the surveys, we can only ask people who are above 18, so we don't know exactly what's going on, but there are some further there. What we saw in the reactions towards, for example, lockdowns during the pandemic, was of course it was younger people as well who were kind of not willing with that, to go with that. And if you look into the values sphere, you can even understand, high on having fun, and that younger generation was important to them and they couldn't do it. It doesn't mean that they are less democratic in that sense. I don't think that this is something that you should take away from this. And as far as the studies that I have seen on a limited number of countries was that they are dissatisfied with what was done, but they didn't turn away from democracy so far. And we should of course work on this, and that's why we have the European Year of Youth this year. I think good initiatives, but more things can be done. Yeah.
You could see some enthusiasm from Monique, because she's actually running a survey among high school students.
Very good, very good.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity and congratulations. I will read the report and get to know more about the other ones too, because you're doing quite important research. I noticed. An anecdote. 2 years ago, I think I was in France. I saw these gilets jaunes having a auberge du Macron, where you could have a coffee. So I entered and I spoke with these people. And you started your expose with, under what conditions people are confronting our democratic institutions with their values because these institutions don't deliver anymore. I spoke with them and they were, just having a mission of life again, coming together to change the social condition of many people in these deserts, as they call it. they felt alone. And they looked upon each other and they said, well, we just have to do it ourselves. And they installed a kind of mini-state with taxes. Gilets jaunes in your car you could pass, if not you had to pay, that kind of state-like behavior in their own field. So they were really revolutionary in the sense that they said, we want to make another system. Now you are doing this kind of research, you are informing the European policy community. Two questions. Is what policies in the European scenery are amenable to listen carefully to these policy value kind of warnings that you are issuing? And the second one, what is their reaction anyway on this kind of research? What kind of position do you have to influence, the Commission and other policy actors in this Brussels area where you are? Could you give us some clues of, and how could we help you perhaps also with the research that is done by this excellent team?
Absolutely, and thanks for the question. And we had this already during the lunch as an important question. How can we, from the research side, not only necessarily influence, but inform policy and policy making better, which is usually hard. My unit specifically in the JRC works exactly on this, on trying to get evidence more into policy making, into the process, and taken up by colleagues. And it's a hard job because usually scientists and policymakers have different goals, different time frames especially. Working on for 20 years on one research project cannot work in politics. But actually I'm not that pessimistic about it, because one way this is of course done and can be done is through better regulation, which tells, at least in the Commission, colleagues how they should approach policymaking. And we have multiple steps in there that can be either extended or, well, improved. And we know that citizen engagement as an exercise is a tool in the better regulation toolbox. That means actually you can do this around all policies. You don't necessarily need this on each standard definition that the Commission does, but there are many policies where you can do that and where it is already done to some degree. We see, for example, the project on the new European Bauhaus, where we have multiple citizen engagement exercises around Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, and it can be done. But I think, there needs to be commitment for this. And I see several policy DGs being super interested in what we do, why we do it and how we do it. And I think for communication, everyone sees it. Everyone sees, okay, so values are important, they have different values, so we just need to communicate it better. The harder fight is, but you also need to listen better. It's not only communicating better, but it's also understanding, well, there might be different perspectives, exactly. And I personally am optimistic because we have the demand. We have also in our unit the Competence Center on Deliberative and Participatory Democracy recently opened, and we have many colleagues signing up for, how do I do this? Because it's very, we know from the science, just bringing people together in a room without any structure is not a good idea, because then the extremes get extremer. But you need to have the proper processes, how to create a safe space so people are willing to open up, willing to also listen to the others, and doing that in the right way. And we have some examples in recent reports around the rights in Ireland, abortion and gay marriage, where it works, even on highly polarized issues, but there needs to be some courage in using it, exactly. So I see there's demand, we are heard. I give presentations also internally on this, but I think it's a long road, and the more research there is that gives us more munition, or ammunition for this in a good sense, not in the other related sense, then I think we can turn a tide in better listening. Because democracy is not just voting every 4 years or 5 years. It is having to be lived and having to understand throughout. So I hope that answers, at least to some degree, even though I'm the researcher, I'm not doing any policies, but we see the demand.
We have one final question from Harold Benning, Professor of European Economics at our school.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. Thank you for your nice presentation, very interesting. I was triggered by your distinction between European values and EU values in terms of identification. You mentioned the example of Norway, which is of course a very good example. But immediately I started thinking about another country, let's call it Brexit Britain. It's clear they didn't want to be part of the, or a large majority didn't want to be part of the EU anymore. But what does it say about their identification with European values? And the second part of the question is, may this be changing, that the United Kingdom could become perhaps, could start identifying more with European values when I look at the crisis with Ukraine and how they are in terms of, they are one of the leaders in terms of, say, support, financial support. So how do you view the identification of the United Kingdom with European values?
And the EU, I guess, which is, yeah, exactly. I think this one is a fascinating topic in general on the UK. I mean, I looked through many studies in preparation of this report, and we thought, do we also specifically go into Brexit, which was at the time still relevant, nowadays a little bit less talked about. And what we saw was that the attitude towards the EU, so towards membership in the EU, actually didn't change so much over time. So that was an interesting find, that you know, for many, this historical event was seen through, they were all manipulated into voting this way or that way. But if you look into the evidence, that was even years before, it was around 50%. Do we want to stay? Do we not stay? And then only towards the end, there was this, yeah, direction towards no, we leave. And we also had some experts who actually did advise some parties in the UK at the time and knew that there were some strategic errors being made because some people were feeling confident that they would remain and that people would vote the other way. But I think in the UK you have, we don't need to fear that people turn away from the values that we care about in the EU, but they never fully saw themselves as being part of the EU. So it's not the European Union. That was a different issue to them than the values that stand behind them. And there is something to be said around, do the values always play out in each country in the same way? So do we agree that, yeah, we stand for democracy, we stand for rule of law, but it's actually turned into reality? And I think was not the perception in the UK. And if we want to avoid something like that again, then we need to make sure that people understand that this is not just something that we say here in Brussels, but it's actually reality in that country. And that was our impression. It didn't feel that way. They didn't feel like, yeah, this is democracy. They felt, that was also the narrative, the decisions are taken here in Brussels and they have no meaning or no decision power on this, which is of course not true. Through the council they have, and the parliament, sorry.
Thank you so much, Mario. We have some beers from Tilburg, because you know, at Tilburg University we not only produce knowledge, skills, and character, but we also produce beer. You also get a few atlases, but you know, the first edition is actually going to our special guest, so we'll give you that later.
No problem. Many thanks. And yeah, beer as a German in Belgium. Yeah. That's beer. Yeah. Very good.
Thank you, Mario. Thanks so much, Mario, for opening actually the scientific part of today. Because now we have a good overview of what values are, how they can be used by politicians, and we are now moving to the presentation of the Atlas. And I would like to welcome Marga van Zundert, who's welcome. I'd like to welcome Marga van Zundert, who is one of the authors of the Atlas. She has written an essay especially for today, and she would like to present the essay to all of us.
Thank you. I'm not a scientist, but a science writer added to the team working on the Atlas. And you call it an essay. As a science writer, I would call it a column. So just a short column. Okay. Working on the chapter about democracy in the Atlas, I suddenly remembered a science fiction story I read a long time ago. A story about a future election day, on which voters didn't need to go to the polling station. On this future election day, just one single randomly selected citizen would be interviewed. His or her answers would be sufficient for artificial intelligence to calculate the results of the elections flawlessly. I didn't remember much more about the story other than this one voter ID. But Google's artificial intelligence immediately turned up more information. The story is called Franchise and was written by Isaac Asimov. Asimov, of course, I thought, because I used to snatch books from my Aunt Francine's bookcase as a teenager. Asimov was definitely one of her favorites and soon became mine too. Unsurpassed Wikipedia contains, of course, a page on franchise. I learned that the story was published in 1955, that the randomly selected person was called the Voter of the Year, and that the story was set in the USA in 2008. In reality, Barack Obama won the elections in that year, not thanks to one voter, but to 69,498,516 voters. Asimov's story made me wonder. Would artificial intelligence in 50 years perhaps be able to provide all the data for a future Atlas of European Values by interviewing just one randomly selected Dutch person, one Russian, one Belgian, one German, one Albanian, etc.? Or perhaps by interviewing just one European? Will future algorithms be able to correctly predict our political preferences, our moral judgments, our values, just as they are already making correct predictions about climate change, the maliciousness of a tumor, or the most efficient synthetic route to a new chemical? Things many of us would not imagine 50 years ago. Considering the progress in artificial intelligence, I'm personally quite convinced that this moment will indeed come, maybe sooner than many expect. A nice prospect for the European Value Studies, just one questionnaire. Yet, working on the Atlas, the idea that elections will anytime soon be determined by the Voter of the Year became less and less likely to me. In every interview I held, the word trust popped up. Whether the topic was on migration, the welfare state, identity, or democracy, and whether I spoke to someone from Iceland, Portugal, Lithuania, Georgia, or Sweden. Trust seems to be today's keyword, and unfortunately, often because we worry that trust is declining. Trust in science, in journalism, in each other, and in politics. It may therefore seem likely that we're heading towards the paradoxical situation that when artificial intelligence will be able to predict elections correctly, no one will trust the result. However, the Atlas itself actually brings happy news on trust. Trust in others is pretty high in Europe, and more importantly, trust still increases in most countries with each new, young, and better educated generation. Politicians, however, tend to fall outside people's circle of trust. People are often more suspicious of politicians than of a neighbor or even someone they meet for the first time. According to the Atlas, just about anybody is more trustworthy than a politician. Which brings me to a conclusion and a suggestion for the debate later on about the gap between politics and citizens. A thought in line with, for example, the idea of David van Rijbroek in Against Elections. A Voter of the Year may not be such a good plan, but to bridge the gap, we should seriously consider randomly selected Politicians of the Year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marga. And maybe some of you already noticed that we have a new guest among us. Permanent representative of Netherlands to the EU, Mr. Robert de Groot, is here among us to actually to get the first edition of the first copy of the Atlas. And we asked actually to have the best ambassador of the European Value Study Atlas at the Atlas of European Values, Wim van den Donk, to present it to meneer de Groot, Mr. de Groot. Wait. The microphone, maybe.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Your
Oh, here.
Excellency. Is it okay?
Yeah, but we should
Yeah, the
stand here.
stream,
Yeah.
sorry, yes, okay.
It's all YouTube, YouTube-wise.
Okay, YouTube-wise, okay. Thank you so much. Robert, we are glad that you're here as our permanent representative to the European Union, European Commission. And we know that you are indeed one of these people that are working day and night in keeping that idea of Europe alive. And I remember last time we had contact was in summer when the budget talks were going on. I remember very well. And although this is, you know, the hard work that Max Weber was talking about in, you know, trying to change a situation. It's like having screws in hard wood. You know, it's very tough work. It's day-to-day work. It's craftsmanship. But that work cannot be done with a set of beliefs in why we are doing this, and where this is all good for. And we started this session with the notion of coal and steel. We were thinking, Robert, about those people in that factory now struggling for their lives and for values and ideas that indeed were behind that idea between coal and steel. Because that whole idea behind coal and steel was reconciliation, peace, human dignity. Never again, we promised. And I think that, you know, we make many atlases of landscapes, of cities, of countrysides, the morphology and so on, and that's very important work. Because, you know, to find your way and to get knowledgeable about the specific characteristics of a certain landscape of country, it's important to know what you're talking about. And good science is providing data and is making these available in a way that it is, well, for the bigger people, very easy to orientate yourself. This atlas is not about landscapes, not about roads and cities. In a way it is perhaps, but it's about the more deeper layers underground. And I'm not talking about the pipelines and so on, it's about the values. It's a very intriguing project. Tim presented it very meticulously already for decades going on. Founded by two people I had the honor to know, Ruud de Moor and Jan Kerkhoff. Actually met them several times, and these two scientists, social scientists, were passionate about values and about Europe, so the combination was very easily made. At that time already, indeed, from a kind of worrisome perspective. Where will people believe in if they believe no longer in a common God or something like that, as they used to call it? What's going to happen with Europe, since we know that these founders of Europe were devout people in the sense that they really had a kind of transcendent belief that Europe was not just a political adventure, but has a mission that was more important than their lives and had to become more important for the generations after them. What's going on in Europe from that perspective? How our value landscape evolving? Is the hope that Monique was referring to justified, that new generations indeed bring other perspectives than we tend to believe from the earlier generations. All this, Robert, is meticulously researched and it is reported in this atlas. And indeed, I'm an ambassador because I think this is very important research, as was presented in the talk here before. But yes, that, you know, policymakers should know about values, not only about regulation, not only new technologies, but also what the mentality of society is in order to accept all these changes. Because accepting change is difficult, because it might include changing values, which is even more difficult. So it's very, very important that policymakers are well informed and that they know that there is an atlas of European values, which indeed might be universal in a sense too, but that's one of these intriguing questions that will be answered when reading the atlas. It is presented in a nice way. I congratulate all the researchers that have been contributed, because this is really teamwork all over Europe and even in the world. Many, many people have contributed to the data sets, the quality of the data sets, and comparing data on values is even more difficult than comparing data on many, many other fields. Because only the language you use to ask a question, you have to reflect 10 times whether the question is asked in a way that you are measuring the same value. Very, very concrete, but very difficult and high-end research has been done. So, Robert, when they asked me to present the atlas to you, I said yes, but it doesn't feel just that I will present it to you. I think the researchers should do it. And they are here, and I think that, whereas Inge, Luc, and Ruud, and Tim, and Marga, that you should present this work, that is your common work, to the permanent representative of the Netherlands, to the European Commission and the European Union. Because I would love to do it, because I know he is one of these people in Brussels that is working so hard to keep the dream, but also the reality of Europe alive. But I would feel ashamed to give something I did not make myself. So please come to the fore. And hand it over in an appropriate way to Robert.
Where do you want me to stand YouTube wise?
Yes.
Well, dear on the dock, dear team from whom I got this first atlas, and what a day to hand over this new atlas you have worked on for so many years. A day where we should celebrate, a day when we should remember, but also a day today in Europe under very difficult circumstances, and also a day where we think back of the time when we started this project in 1958. And by coincidence, there are only one or two people still, this one or this one, I'm seeing this one better. There are only one or two people still alive who were there at the ceremony in 1958. One happens to live in Brussels, Francesco Fresi. He is 94 years old, and he was one of the most junior people who you can see very much in the background on this famous photograph from 1958. And this is the project we started in those days, and the project you have been working on so hard, and which is also the time when we look back on the moment that we started, in fact, our value-driven journey in Europe, and in fact, which was the basis also for the world order we built after the Second World War. And this order is under threat, not only in Europe, but also globally. And unfortunately, peace on our continent once again is now shattered by conflict, where we can see thousands of people rudely awakened by violence. And it's also the second time the Ukraine and Ukrainian people have to face this over the past decade, the first time being in 2014. And the initial responses also in Europe, but also worldwide, were very much together, joined, and in a collective way of saying that this is not what we want to see, and this is not what we want people on the European continent to experience. But by now, since the 24th of February, we can already see, and it's not a very long time, that things are getting more difficult. While at the same moment, we are here, I'm afraid, for the long haul. So how is Europe going to respond? How are we going to stay united? And how are we going to make sure we emerge from this crisis stronger than we were before? And for that reason, this atlas and the timing today is extremely relevant. At this moment in time, I'm looking at the clock, 2:30. There are speeches going on in the European Parliament by the President of the Commission, Mrs. von der Leyen, and by the French President, Emmanuel Macron, exactly on the issue we are discussing here today, our common and our joint European values. And maybe we have to go back in time a little bit further and, for example, think of what Václav Havel and François Mitterrand initiated in 1991, which was in fact a confederation of European countries. It failed in those days to get traction, but maybe if we look at the situation today, we could give it another thought. And especially in a Europe where we can see that the structures we built over the past decades are not functioning or in fact on life support. If we look at the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, in Vienna, what is this organization worth after what Mr. Putin has done? The Council of Europe, equally very important, but also in a difficult situation. And maybe we should think back of what Václav Havel and François Mitterrand initiated, is to build a European home for everybody in Europe, nobody excluded. So it should include the President of the Ukraine and all Ukrainians. But it should also be a house for people from Norway and from the UK and from continental Europe and from the Western Balkans. So I think as we move along in time in this very difficult period with war on the European continent, we should look on new ways to establish the community of values we built so many years ago and which is now under threat. And I say Europe here, and I don't say the European Union, and I say that for a reason, because it's so easy to just start from the binary perspective of the European Union, whether you're a member or not. And I'm not quite sure the present time and the present challenges are binary. So we also have to be open and creative to look for further and new homes we could build on the European continent, where everybody and our way of life is unique in this world, where everybody can feel at home and can feel part of the family. Now, maybe one aspect on the future of this continent, which cannot do without values, and I think your atlas is extremely important in that sense, because values and our social model is our unique global selling point. This is what determines whom we are and what Europe is. And we should continue to prioritize the rule of law, our investment in the people working inside the European economy, and last but not least, becoming a more geopolitical actor, also to preserve the way we feel a society should be built. And there is also today the end of another exercise to ask European citizens, in fact only, unfortunately, citizens from within the Union, although Western Balkan countries did participate to a certain extent, but the finalization of the conference on the future of Europe. And this was a conference we felt should be conducted by citizens and not by people like me in civil servant positions, nor by politicians, nor by members of the European Parliament. This was an exercise for and by European citizens. And they have now produced, with great difficulties, because there were many thoughts on the table and around the table, a product which is there with 49 proposals, which should be worked on now by member states and government of member states to see what are we going to do with the priorities set out by European citizens. And I think these 49 priorities, together with this wonderful atlas together, should determine the stage for where we are going in the coming years, which, with a Europe which is now facing this terrible war. And that is why I feel delighted to receive this copy of the new edition. And I believe that communication of the European projects cannot be done through regulations and directives and conclusions by politicians getting together in meeting. I think this is the basis. And the will of the people and the expression of the people on where they want to go. And I think this is something we should keep close to our hearts and really never forget when we do our work, and I certainly won't. And I know all my colleague ambassadors, all 26 of them, will watch this with a very close eye every day, as we did yesterday when we were discussing a new sanctions package vis-à-vis Russia. And although we might not always agree on the exact details of the rule of law, of governance, and how values should be translated into a political system, I know one thing, and in the end, everybody around the table is interested in finding a compromise to move forward and to do that for the better and the good of the citizens of Europe. So I'm going to cherish this atlas. I will look into it regularly. I will see it as a result of research where at least once a week one should refer to make sure that I have my guidance on what to do. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. de Groot, for your warm words for the Atlas, and also for making the Atlas ever more relevant in these turbulent times. And it's 187 pages. It's actually a bit more than we originally prospected, because indeed there is so much to show actually in the European Value Study. And to give a snapshot of what's actually in the Atlas, I would like to invite Luc and Inge, two of the authors of the Atlas, to present findings, relevant findings, among some charts of all these several graphs and charts that are present in the Atlas. And now we're into some logistical issues.
Yes.
Maybe get some help from. I think we.
I think
I think I removed the slide now.
Okay. Yeah, this is the. Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to present well, it is presented already, the first issue of the new Atlas. I myself have no copy at the moment, so I'm a little bit lost now.
We are waiting.
Yes, okay. And my first, what I have to say is that we call it the Atlas of European Values, but that if I listen to the discussion now, it can be a little bit confusing because it is not the values, the European values, it is the values of the Europeans. And it is more than only the European values, and it is not the values, it is values of Europeans. So it is quite confusing, I have to say. But, well, that is also what we have to struggle with. And it is not everything that is in our project. It is simply what we think is important, is interesting for the broader audience. Well, as it is already said, it is written by 4 persons. 3 are much more important than I was for this atlas. So Tim, Inge, and Marga, and especially Marga, she did a splendid job in and what she told before. that is also the reason why we invited her to work again on the Atlas, because she can express it much better in ordinary terms than we can. We often do statistics, we often use statistical terms, and we think that we are very wise in what we express and what we say, but she is able to translate that in simple, ordinary language. So thank you, Marga, for that. You did a splendid job, I think. So the Atlas of European Values, Change and Continuity in Turbulent Times. It has been expressed already that we are living really in turbulent times. We didn't expect it. And the turbulent times now are not because we invented this title, because the title was already there before all the turbulence started in Europe. We had no crystal ball that we expected it, but well, it happened, and unfortunately that is the case. Atlas of European Values. So the first question is, of course, why on earth should there be an Atlas of European Values? That is the first issue that we want to say something about here. We say something about European values, which was already done by Ruud, so we will not repeat everything he said here. And then only a snapshot, a few tables, a few graphs and maps will be shown to you without much explanation, because they speak for themselves, I think, and you can all have your own interpretation for that. And in the Atlas, if you will see, as you will see, there are already some interviews with experts giving some more explanation and interpretation on the results that are presented there. And then Inge, she has started together with people from Fontys, University of Applied Sciences in Tilburg, an e-value project, and she will explain something about that project. So why on earth is there an atlas? Why is that necessary? I hinted already a little bit on that, because we as scientists present our data in all kinds of nice statistics, which we can read. We have nice tables, and I could show you our a book completely only with tables, large tables, pages of tables, and they are not interesting for people, ordinary people. That is boring stuff to them. So in order to also translate the data that we collect in our surveys for ordinary people, for people who are interested in values, and we know that many people are basically interested in values, although we have no idea what they are and how to see them and how to observe them in society, but still people have the feeling that they are important. So they are interested in it, and this is, we think, a way to inform them about what values are in Europe and how European values, or how the values of Europeans are distributed and how they differ and are the same in all kinds of countries. So making the data available and accessible to non-specialists, that is one of the main purposes of our atlas. And indeed it reveals the unity and the diversity in the values of the Europeans. So the motto of the European Union, united in diversity, is still correct. It is not something that is something in the past, it is still relevant today. There is diversity, but there is also homogeneity in some of the orientations. And it is not so that the European countries are coming closer to each other, so are more homogeneous in their orientations. There remain differences, and sometimes big differences. Well, when we presented the first Atlas of European Values in 2005, and Wim, he already said something about the soul of the Europeans, that was exactly the words chosen by our then Prime Minister, Jan Peter Balkenende, who already was interested very much in values and started already a discussion on values in Europe. And he, in the Atlas, in the preface to that, he already spoke about the soul of the Europeans. And he, well, as we already know, of course, the Atlas, he said, is a treasure trove of information on the wealth of opinions about Europe and the forces that binds us in spite of our differences. And I think that is very correct, and that is also what you will see, what you will learn from the Atlas that we have produced now. As said, it is the third issue, third edition of the Atlas. The first one appeared in 2005, based on 1999 data. The second one appeared in 2011, and that was based on 2008 data collection. And now we are in 2022, and this is based on data collected already in 2017, 2018. So it is some time ago, but also the production of an atlas cost time, unfortunately. It is based on the European Value Study, which is a survey project, a longitudinal international comparative research survey project on what we call then basic human values. It covers value domains that are distinguished in the questionnaire on family, work, religion. So all the main life domains are covered in the questionnaire. So it is a very broad source of information. Well, the data is collected in these years, 1981. It is already reminded by Wim and also by Ruud. That it started already at the end of the 70s, and indeed with a concern of the two founding fathers of what is happening in the world. And it was not only about, let's say, the assumed moral decline and not only about secularization, it was broader than that. It was also about how people live together. Why on earth is there social cohesion, or is that threatened or not? So it is more than only secularization or religion as a high topic. During the years, the data quality has improved tremendously. Also, of course, the knowledge about how to collect data has improved, and we adapted, of course, to that. And the data, and that is maybe good for people who are working with the data themselves, the data are freely accessible in the data archive in Cologne, so that you can do your own analysis and make an own atlas. Our atlas now is built on we distinguish 6 parts, and they are, well, let's say, the main themes of contemporary European Union: identity, welfare, migration, sustainability, solidarity, and democracy. You see immediately that these are also the main themes in the European Union and the leaders there. And we thought it is better to focus on these themes than on what was in the previous atlases, on the life domains, which is, of course, broader than these themes now. Sustainability, identity.
We're going to do a presentation, so we're switching. So first, some graphs, maps maybe on identity. And I'm too small for this.
Ik heb geen idee. Ja, techniek, hè? Techniek.
I will make myself taller a bit. It's also possible. Thanks. Okay, so first a graph, a map on identity, and I think this is one that we already hinted on. Mario, you hinted on this, and I think Harald also mentioned this one, feeling European. And indeed, the picture is quite diverse, And what we see is indeed that Norwegians feel very European. 89% of the people in Norwegian feel European, while other countries are scoring much less. For example, Italy, only 49%. Only, still a lot of people, but still. So this identity is a kind of a complex issue. And we also talked about younger generations. Do they feel maybe more European or not? And then the picture is even more diverse. So if you look in different countries, so we have here some countries which have populations that feel very European, like Germany, for example. We see that it's mainly the older generations. So the silent generation is the one born before 1954, 45. Generation Z is the generation born after 1997. So in France and Germany, it's more the older generations, while in other countries, it's more the younger generations, also in Great Britain. And then in Russia, it's quite low all over. Food for thought. I'm not going to explain a lot about it. We're simply showing you some maps and graphs. Then there was another topic, welfare. And welfare, of course, is a very important topic for governments to have people who can live in wealth, but also people who are happy, who are satisfied with their lives. Happiness and satisfaction give somewhat the same picture here, but I chose here satisfaction in life, which is more the cognitive evaluation of your life, you could say. Happiness is more an emotional state. And what we see here is that some countries score very high, like Norwegian people, Swiss people, people in Iceland. When you say, how satisfied are you with your life, and give it a score from 1 to 10, they give an 8, which is very high. The Netherlands is not bad as well, 7.8. And on the other side, you have people like in Bulgaria, which only have like a 6. And what we see is that people who live in the more richer countries are more satisfied with their lives. Because you can see, not the bars, but the line, it shows the wealth in the country, the GDP per capita. And the more wealthier a country is, the more satisfied the people are. Although there are some exceptions, like Bosnia. It's somewhat satisfied people, but not so wealthy. And it also, this relationship has been shown by many researchers, that there's a link between welfare and well-being. But it doesn't imply that with economic growth, you can increase happiness. So this is something to bear in mind. This is the Easterlin paradox for people who know this. So, yeah. Luke?
Maybe I can add something about that relationship, because this is, of course, at the aggregate level. And it is not in the current atlas, but in one of the previous atlases. At the individual level, the relationship is not so evident. So it is not that the richer people are, at the individual level, are also more happy than those who have lower incomes. But at the aggregate level, yes, it is working in this way. That it doesn't mean anything that politicians should not be careful, etc., etc. So it's simply a scientific result. Migration is, of course, one of the splitting issues nowadays in many countries. I don't tell you anything new here. We also focused on that. And we all know that migration, is seen by many people resulting in loss of jobs, crime rates are increasing, a decline of national culture is feared. There's a threat of national welfare systems, etc. All these issues are mentioned and causing, polarization in societies. We asked for, the acceptance of migrants in their society. And as you can see, the darker the color, the less migrants are accepted in these societies. So the northwestern European countries appear to be a little bit more accepting them than the eastern, the far eastern countries, as you can see. And it is measured by the opinions on what I mentioned, fear of loss of job, criminality, and a strain on the national welfare system, a combination of that. And then, of course, the question, should they assimilate or should they integrate? Then you can see that in most countries, it is integration that is preferable than assimilation. Again, you see that there are differences in Europe, that in some countries, Georgia, Albania, for instance, there they say, well, they should assimilate and not integrate in their society. In the Atlas, we also have some questions about the high levels of acceptance or hospitality in Iceland and in Albania, two countries that we did not see, let's say, that they are equal in the acceptance, but they are open to these people. The reasons for that, the experts in these countries argue well. Many people on Iceland, they have experience, they travel abroad, they studied abroad, so they have experience with these people, whereas in Albania, well, we have always been open to these people, to newcomers, so it is an historical issue for us. But of course, we have more immigrants, people leaving the country, than immigrants, so we are not bothered by them. Sustainability?
Yes, sustainability. We ask quite a lot of questions on the environment and sustainability, and one of them is, do you think that governments should prioritize a good environment over, even if it comes at a cost of less growth, economic growth, or maybe some job losses? And what we see is that actually a lot of people, the majority of people, have prioritized the environment. And I think this is something that politicians sometimes forget when they speak about the environment and the economy. A lot of people are actually prioritizing the environment, even if it comes at a cost. And we show here some diversion, because Mario was also saying that there's much variation within countries. So we have here a graph showing this attitude by gender. And you see that women in general are a little bit more prioritizing the environment, although in the Netherlands the differences are very small, 62 versus 64%. And also by income. And with income, one could suspect that if you have a higher income, of course you can it's more easy to say that you prioritize the environment because you are wealthy enough to do so. But what you see here in these graphs is that actually also people with a lower income prioritize environment over economy. And in some countries, it's even the lower income groups which have these attitudes even more. And maybe also somewhat surprising is that if you look at generations again, if you think about who is the most environmentally conscious generation, we always may think it's the youngest generation. That would be the more pink one. But you can see that it depends in the countries. So there are also countries in which the somewhat little less older generations, like my generation, for example, is leading this debate. So that is also something to keep in mind here. I'm not a millennium, by the way. Solidarity.
Yes, solidarity, the almost last issue that we discuss. Well, the willingness to support others without immediately getting something in return. That is what the description of solidarity could be. And interpersonal trust, as you can imagine, is one of the most important issues here. We talked about it already, trust. The belief that another is not out to harm you or to deceive you. That is then the kind of definition of trust. And of course, it is necessary for social cohesion in society. If we don't trust each other, then yeah, why should you have a social cohesion in your society. We were talking about, and already it was mentioned before, that the farther away people are, the less trusting they are. But there are differences in Europe. In the northwestern part of Europe, trust is more generalized. So it is not only your own family, but it is also the neighbors, your acquaintances, but also other people you have never seen before. So this is the first issue of the circle of trust, the radius of trust, as sociologists call it. The trust in the family, which is high, and the lighter the color in this graph, this map, the more people trust their family members. And you see all over Europe that is rather high, percentages of more than 80%. Trust in acquaintances, there you see some more differences already, that it is lower in most countries, particularly in the eastern part of it. When we go to the neighbors, then that is already, again, a little bit farther away for many people. So the levels of trust are indeed lower than when it comes to family and acquaintances. And the least trusted are people you meet for the first time. But still, in many countries, and particularly in the northwestern part of Europe, these levels are rather high compared to the rest of Europe. So in the northwestern part of Europe, it is more generalized trust. Democracy, that is the last thing that we are discussing in the Atlas. Democracy, well, we all know that it is at stake in many countries. We have a lot of problems due to polarization and fragmentation in society. Well, and migrants, they are an important source, apparently, in many countries for this polarization and, well, the threat for democracy. But are we really have to worry about democracy? No, when we ask about is democracy important, throughout Europe, people find democracy important. So apparently, we are convinced that democracy is a good way of living in our society, but that doesn't mean that we still support a strong leader in many countries also. So democracy and support for a strong leader are not necessarily each other's opposites. They can be combined in some countries. Of course, I say of course, I don't know if it is of course, but in some of the Eastern European countries, Romania, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, support for strong leaders is much higher than in the Western European countries, as you can see. You may ask yourself why on all the maps that we show you, there are gray countries. It is not that they are gray countries, but we simply did not present the data because we don't have the data, because we did not include all the countries. We were unhappy with that, but not all countries were able to find sufficient sources, financial sources for the survey. We have data from Ukraine that will be, of course, asked immediately, why is not Ukraine there? We have data, but when we produced the Atlas, the data was not yet available. That's why it is lacking here. And now for the even more important part.
Yes, because we only presented a few maps and graphs, but maybe you're interested what else is there, and you can do it yourself. So if you go to the Atlas of European Values.eu, you come to a website and there's a map tool, which you can click. It also works on your mobile phone, so you can do it right now. You can look up some, type in topics and a map will appear. So I here have a map on importance of living in a country governed democratically. And you can see for yourself the percentage of people who agree with this statement. So you can browse through all the EVS questions. You can also compare maps and then, for example, select 2 different topics or select different respondent groups. For example, I have here selected young and old people. Young are on the left, elderly people are on the right, and you can see that elderly people appreciate this a little bit more than the younger generation. So you can make your own comparisons. You can also select periods, because Luke told you that we have data from 1981 onwards. So you can also see trends in time. So you can play with it yourself. And why we do this, I'm the coordinator of an eValue project, European Values in Education, because this is very handy to use in education. So if you go to secondary schools, citizenship education is out there and in curricula, and a lot of teachers are struggling with this, how to do this. And this is a tool that we developed. We also developed teaching materials with it that teachers can use, and they can do 2 things with it. They can talk about the differences, of course, or the similarities, where do they come from, and that increases our understanding of each other. So there is value clarification, one can say. What are the values and why are they there? And it also facilitates value communication because it gives students the opportunity to think for themselves, where do I stand? What is my identity? And is this maybe different from one of my other students? And you can start a discussion from that. So we hope that it will help students and teachers to talk about values and to bring also more understanding to the classroom. So there are a lot of different tools on the website if you want to see it. Yeah, I would like to promote it a little bit here. So that's why I finish with this. And also last remark is that the Atlas, it's an open access product. So the PDF is online and that's a different website than this one. It's valuesatlas.eu, valuesatlas.eu. Thank you.
Thank you, Inge and Luc. I know we're running over time, but maybe I will open the floor for 2 questions, 2 very important questions, if you have them. If not, I mean, I think we can go for a coffee break, where we can also discuss a little bit more what's in the Atlas. Let's go into the coffee break. I suggest for half an hour. I think we are going to extend the program at 15 minutes because I think we all need a little bit of caffeine. Thank you. I do. We zijn een beetje op tijd aan het gaan, maar het is wel interessant. Zeker, 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 zeker. Daar gaat het om. Mooi, mooi. Zei dat? Dankjewel. We're still waiting for some people. So welcome back for the second part of today's presentation of the Atlas of European Values. We have actually a plenary debate planned now. And we'd like to invite, first of all, Tom Berendsen, who is a member of European Parliament for CDA. As well as Kita Muis, who's our colleague, a PhD student at the Department of Sociology at Tilburg University. And also Mario Scharfbillig, who's a researcher at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. So I put already over here the Atlas. I think it's really important to start with this one because I asked the three of you, well, can you actually send me like which graph, which map appeals most to you? And maybe for the direction, we can start with the first. Map, which has been submitted by Tom Berendsen. It's a map about trust in institutions. Tom, yes, indeed. There's a microphone for each and every one of you. So, why did you actually pick this graph, this map?
Well, because is it working? Yeah. Because I think trust and maybe declining trust in our society, in the institutions, and well, I think it says police, politicians. It's not law. It's
the police, parliament,
justice
civil
system,
service, and justice system, indeed. Yeah.
And these kind of things are essential in our society. And I think as politicians, we should take this up as a huge challenge and something that is worrying at the same time in our society. Yeah.
Yes, so how much focus are politicians actually on trust figures?
Well, on trust figures, I don't know. They are focused, or we are focused on figures, but it's more the polls, which are somehow maybe an effect of trust as well, or the trends of trust. The difficult thing is, should you focus on figures, or should you simply try to add yourself to the feeling of trust and do what you promise? I mean, that's essentially the first thing as a politician you should do, and something that we're not always very good at.
Yeah. I have one question which has to do with Netherlands, because you're representative of the Netherlands. Like the last few months, there's a big discussion taking place in the Netherlands about the question if Netherlands is a low-trust society. We saw that there was a lot of trust in politics and institutions at the start of the corona crisis and suddenly plummeted. What do you think about that? Is Netherlands a low-trust society?
Well, we should be careful not to become one, definitely. Also, if you look at the list of press freedom, we went down from, I don't know, top 5 to 22 or 23. So we really need to be careful, and we cannot take it as how do you say that? We can't take it for granted. We need to work on it every day, and I think there are many figures and situations that show that we need to be careful there. Yeah.
Thank you. Kita, I think that Tom already ate a little bit of the cheese of your bread. Can we see the next slide, the next graph? Oh, yeah. Exactly, too much cheese. So you actually selected this graph.
Is it the two of them? Yeah.
It's the first one
yeah.
About independent media.
Yeah, so this was actually why I wanted to pick this graph. So there was 2 weeks ago, I think, the report, the index of world free press. And actually, overall, the picture was that it's not going that well with the free press in the world, and especially the Netherlands has quite a decline on this list. So we went from 6 to 28, I think. But when you look at this graph, I think that overall, the trust is quite high, that the press is independent from politics and commercial institutions, for example. But when we look at the second one, I think that is even more interesting.
Can you show the second?
This multitasking. Relax.
It's about indeed the percentage of people who believe that political violence is almost always justified.
Yeah, so why I picked this graph and why I think this is something to worry about is that we see that actually the Netherlands is normally quite like high trusting country, and also in comparison with these other countries where we saw that we trust the press quite a lot. We see that here, for example, in the Netherlands, the justification of political violence is actually relatively quite high. And this was also one of the reasons why the Netherlands dropped on this list, on this index, because there was a lot of instances in which violence was used against journalists, for example, the murder of Peter R. de Vries, Dutch people know probably. So there were a lot of instances where violence was used against journalists, and that was one of the reasons why we dropped so much on this list. And I think that actually these kind of figures are quite worrisome. So maybe not polarization in itself, but the justification to use violence, or Mario also talked about this feeling of tension and of hate against other groups or other people with other ideas is increasing or might be strengthening. And I think that that is worrisome.
Can you make like links between media, violence, trust, and politics? Do you see links between these three?
Yeah, I think so. I think especially the way that that debates are portrayed in the media, for example, are strengthening these ideas of that there's only one or two opinions that you can have, right? It's one or the other. We see that, for example, this issue polarization is not so much increasing, so people are not increasingly think differently about issues, but they do have the feeling that they have to pick a side. So they either have to pick that they are pro something or against something. And this is really this polarizing idea of having two groups, that there's no nuance or there's nothing in between. Well, actually, we also see on the maps that there is a lot in between this. It's not extreme, the 1 or the 10s on this scale. And I think the media is emphasizing either the 1 or the 10 on the scale.
So also media should actually do in meaningful and ethical communications, I think. That brings us to Mario. Mario, you actually selected 3 graphs and 3 maps, and we're going to show them all. Maybe the first one.
Difficult to choose from all the good graphs.
You can. Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So the first one is the sense of belonging. Why did you choose this?
So, as I said, our report was on values and identities, because to us these two belong together, and this graph here shows it quite well in the sense that we see that in all countries people want to belong. People want to belong to a group, to a construct. We have here the family, the nation, and Europe, and the world. Our town, it's actually not family. And now, okay, it's still there. And to me, striking was that if you look into the belonging to the country, it actually goes up towards the end, where in these countries where people also identify a lot with Europe and the world, so globally. And that means that to me, this signifies that we shouldn't focus so much on whether we should care about our nation or our country, be proud of our country or not. So don't criticize the people who like their country. It's a question of who they also like and how inclusive they are in their belonging. And therefore, we shouldn't do this, as Kita said it very well, don't say us versus them. Don't say you have to be either or. You can be proud of your country, be proud in believing in your country, but also then extend this to other people across the world. And we see here actually Europe and the world being on a very similar level. So those who are caring and belonging, having this feeling of belonging to Europe, usually don't say, but everyone else doesn't matter, but it's actually this belonging to the global society, and that's why I felt it was very important.
How can we bring Europe closer to the people? Maybe that's also a question for the politician.
Perhaps I start, but then I hand over directly to you. I mean, we had mentioned this already, the Conference on the Future of Europe, where our unit also worked on the virtual platform to bring this to life, which is extremely important to let people see that something's going on and that their opinion is valued. This is something that we stress, and I think in the report we didn't stress it enough even, to say people on the one hand care about the outcome, they care about the final policy and what it brings to them, but people also care about the process, how we get there. So they want to be valued, they want to see that people took their opinion into account, even if the final policy is not in line necessarily with what they want. They want to feel that we didn't just decide this over them and disregard this. And therefore, I think more such initiatives are essential to do this.
Yeah. Tom, do you also want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the best way is to deliver concrete results on challenges that people perceive need to be addressed on a European level. When it comes to climate change, when it comes to strategic autonomy these days as well. And I think that's the most important thing that we as politicians should do, deliver concrete results. And people should feel represented by the politicians, which means that what we decide upon here should not be 5 kilometers front-running before the rest of society and people in the countries and member states itself. So I think we should be, especially here in this bubble, we should be aware of that. Yeah, so we of course need to show vision, but at the same time go in a speed that you can take people along. Yeah.
Isn't there sometimes not a tension with national politics? Because when it concerns Europe, sometimes being said, well, yeah, when things go well, when there's really good policy, then politicians, national politicians, they say, well, it's our success. When things go bad, they often attribute it to Europe. How do you see that?
No, that's absolutely true. And it's not something that we experienced 5 years ago, but it would have been good if I knew the exact example, but I know it happened 2 weeks ago as well. By a Dutch minister claiming something very well. I don't know the topic anymore. It would be nice here at this point. But she was claiming something, the Netherlands did this and this. And then in the last sentence, okay, the Netherlands is doing this kind of legislation because it's a European law and everyone should do it. Yeah. But it was somewhere at the very bottom of the whole piece. And the minister was claiming the success. Yeah. And that's what we see happening all the time. And I'm not against ministers claiming success if it's good, but then claim it as a success of European cooperation as well. And there's plenty of space as a Dutch minister or any minister to claim success within the European cooperation. Yeah.
Wait. There's a microphone. Yeah.
Harold Bening from Tilburg University. This is very interesting. We have a very ambitious agenda from the European side, of course, the European Green Deal. Frans Timmermans is leading this agenda. And this is, of course, a very ambitious agenda, which also has to be implemented in the national member states. When looking at this process and what you were just saying, could you elaborate on how you view this process? Is it going well? Is it tricky? Is there a lot of differences between member states?
I think at the moment it's very tricky. And especially also if I can refer back to the graph I've chosen to show here, trust. We're going through huge transitions, both on the energy transition and the digital transition, both big ambitions of the European Commission as well. And when you're going through a transition, you need, it's scary for people. Things are changing. The way they look at the world is changing. The way they earn their money is changing. The way their house looks is changing. Yeah, we need to be very well aware of the fact that we need trust to get people through the transition as well, and especially with something as the Green Deal and the whole Fit for 55 package. that people, I mean, we've spoken about combating climate change and grasping the economic opportunities of that as well. We've been speaking about that for years, but now we're in the phase that the actual implementation is there, and people will notice, and people will feel it in their pockets as well. So that's something we, especially in combination with the trust in people pursuing those transitions, the politicians. Yeah, it's something we need to be very well aware of. Yeah.
Thank you, Harold, by the way, because indeed I'm asking some questions, but it's really good if you, some citizen politics, so to speak, if you also ask some questions, if you want some clarification or you want to ask some imminent issues to the three people in front of us, feel free to raise your voice. You will get the microphone. So yeah, Mario had two more maps, and I think it's good to discuss them as well, because one is really interesting. It's actually about the contours, about what Europe, according and the nation state, actually represents for citizens. So yeah, can you maybe elaborate on this one?
Yes, and I think I chose two graphs at the same time to contrast this a little bit, because the question was who wants what and who sees what as being a true compatriot, being a true European. And we see that the important parts, I mean, of course, there are some people who care really about if it's the joint, I mean, the same religion, or if it's the same ancestry, so ethnicity in a sense. But what is highest, and what's also most important to people, is that people share kind of a common understanding of either culture or the way things are going. And if you go to look to the rest, to the right, it's all about respecting the country's political institutions and laws. Now we heard the contrast now what Kita said, like people already are very high in being willing to attack the media, even if they don't get their way or if they want to implement their own perspectives. So I think this is in a way worrying, but also comforting, because it's comforting that we all want the same thing to a certain degree. We all find it most important that the way our society is governed through the democratic process is the most important for our fellow members. That's the most important thing that we see in this graph. At the same time, we see it's under attack, and we see we need to do something. We need to reinstate this trust in the democratic governance, even if people already agree that it's the most important thing. So there's some polarization here going on within people's minds, I think.
Yeah. You can see, for instance, in the graph that also in the map that also many people actually find it important that Europeans share the same culture. What would then, for instance, apply about extension of the European Union towards the east, extension, the talks with Turkey, with Albania? What do you think about that? Is it important to share the same culture? Does European integration is facilitated by sharing the same culture?
Yes, in the sense of the institutions, I think. I mean, culture as a term itself is extremely broad. What does culture mean? And I think we have even an empirical answer to this in the sense that we have one of the researchers that I looked up these papers a lot on is there convergence towards certain values or not? And is there an identity that's going on here that binds countries together? And I think the empirical answer is yes and no, of course, as scientists like to do. Yes, the supranational identity, the European identity, seems to help moving people in the same direction on average. But the question is, are we fast enough? Are we quick enough that we don't tear ourselves apart while on this transition? Because the speed towards these things is different.
Yeah. Then maybe the final slide. It's about climate change and sustainability. Yeah, still want to go.
So that was the last one I chose. And actually, I wanted to point you towards this counting of who is the typical climate activist. And you see young woman, high levels of education, non-religious, living in a city, and higher income. And to me, the overlap with, for example, attitudes towards immigration is extremely clear. And on the one hand, this is, to me personally, as a member working for JRC, for the science organization, this seems to be a failure of science communication. Because while on the one hand, it's extremely important that we care about this. The Green Deal, one of the biggest policies that we have in the EU, but it seems that it's only for the highly educated that they care about it. But this is not the case. Climate change will impact everyone, and especially the poorer. And that means that for some reason we haven't yet made the transition of communicating it good enough that people with other orientations and who are not highly educated value it at the same time. And that was just for me, seeing this, like, why? Climate change shouldn't just be a values issue. It's important for everyone, and yeah.
You already have suggestions about how to do this? How can we make something like climate change more an imminent issue among the public?
I mean, there's one recommendation, of course, on the science side, which is the thing people I interact most often with, and then don't make it so much about the detail of is it actually how much, what is the degree of certainty behind this, which is of course important within the scientific circles. But in the end, we need to make clear what are the implications, and the implications are not, I mean, don't only focus on the negative side, but also on what can be done for whom, and what is the implication on their daily life, what they can do. And I think we are not doing a good enough job at this moment.
Tom wants to add to that.
Yeah, I think unfortunately we're in the situation that people experience climate change now as well. We've seen the floods, we've seen extreme weather, drought in well, at a lot of places. I wanted to say southern Europe, but we see it here as well. So unfortunately, we are in the situation that people now day to day, or at least at some times of a year, do experience the consequences as well. And I think and I believe that will help as well. We all would have liked to prevent that situation from happening, and that we could have already shown the urgency by the figures and communicating well, etc. But yeah, we are now in the situation that people will notice. Yeah.
Isn't it then also not a responsibility of politics to push maybe a bit further and quicker? Because as you can also see in the Atlas, many people are actually concerned about the climate and want to invest in that as well. While politics is not always following suit. So to what extent should actually politics sometimes run ahead of
definitely on these kind of topics, I think politics should. The reason why it didn't happen is because it's a lot of investments and it's long term, and you don't see the result in the period where you have been elected in or when you're governing. And that's the sad truth, is that a lot of politicians want to show concrete results, and it's not a concrete result if you invest in something that is years ahead. And secondly, the other side of the discussion is, I think as well, is that for a long time, climate adaptation was a word that was not allowed to be used because we need to combat climate change. But that's the truth now as well. We need to invest a lot in climate adaptation because the weather is changing, the climate is changing, and we need to invest there as well. So yeah, we still have a lot to do better in that area, I would say. Yeah.
Beyond your graphs and maps, I selected a few topics that each is going to be introduced by a short clip. So maybe let's watch to the first clip and then continue with the debate.
Democracy means freedom to express views, choose political leaders, and help shape our shared future. But it is under pressure from widespread distrust, fake news, low voter turnout, and polarized attitudes in the public sphere. The EU is leading efforts to reconnect with citizens through our common values. We are developing digital tools to boost democratic participation. And supporting young people's creativity and enthusiasm to get them more politically involved. We want to understand what drives polarization and violent extremism and empower citizens to recognize misinformation and disinformation online. Science and innovation are helping us to fight fake news, build trust, and safeguard our democracies. Of course, what connects all these projects is cutting-edge EU research and innovation. And the mission? to empower citizens and build more resilient democracies across the EU.
So we'd like to talk about the relationship between politics and values and opinions. So how does politics actually keeps track of what people think, what people find important? Is it only every 4 years the polling booth, or how do politicians actually keep track of what people want?
I see you're looking at me, and that's and I understand.
The other two will also get their voice.
I think there's this story or an image or something about I don't know when a French presidency somewhere, and one of the candidates was in an inn sitting at the bar, and then he saw the people passing by, and he asked to the bartender or the innkeeper, he asked, could you tell me where the people are going so I can lead them? So I don't think that's the right thing as well. So obviously you need to know what people want. But as a politician, as a political party, you should also show where you think society should be going, what is needed for that. Maybe some inconvenient truth in it as well. And you should make sure that you convince people that that's the right way to go. So that's one side of the story. Secondly, what I do in practice, I have a lot of people I talk to. We have finally again we can allow visitors groups in the parliament again, and there's no better test for your story than a group of students or a group of people just on a day off. You know, they have a nice day out. You start talking about European politics, and you get the best questions. And if you don't have an answer, you're tested immediately. You're putting on you're put on the spot. So, but I must say that when I read this. Read it, but went through it. Maybe we should look a bit more at these kind of things as well, to have a broader understanding of where we are in society and where we are going, and also whether facts kind of support feelings we have or signs we get from society.
I agree. I think it doesn't happen enough, to be honest, not to attack you personally, but I think that politics doesn't listen to opinions or facts in general enough. I also see it in my own research that what people believe is true, and of course not only politicians, but also the public, that what is true does not always it's not in accordance with what people see is true, and I think that is normal. It also there's a big role of identity here, of social identity and identifying with certain groups. But I think that for politicians, it's their role to see what actually the public thinks and what they should do with the public opinion. And I think that a lot of research shows, I just heard people talking about causality, and I think it's super difficult to investigate this, but a lot of research shows that actually still politics is influencing attitudes of people more than the other way around. And I think that this is, to a certain extent, a good thing, because people can show the way, let's say, or put important issues on the agenda. But we see also that this has its way through polarization, so that polarization in politics, in manifestos between politicians, is trickling down to the mass as well, while it didn't exist before. So I think that this is dangerous, and that that politics is not using the opinions of people or the facts, let's say, of what people really think enough in their policies.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I was asking this is also that in the last few decades, maybe, there have also been politicians who base their agenda on on Instagram polls, on public opinion polls, instant polls, basically. And to what extent is remains ideology still an important factor for parties to position themselves? Yeah, it's an open question. If someone wants to respond, feel free.
I can add one thing maybe that I see in my own research, that now ideology represents more of a social identity, more than a set of beliefs or policy preferences or something like this. So ideology becomes more of a drive of binding people from their identity than really saying, okay, if you are leftist, for example, then it means that you are in favor of these kind of policies. So it becomes more a drive of a social identity, and again, maybe then in that sense a drive of polarization as well, rather than representing a set of policy preferences.
I think there's actually a long history of that research showing that it's not a policy ideology book that people follow if they are for one party or the other, but it was always more this, do I believe the same thing that has been said by the party representing that? In the US, we see, I mean, the evidence is very often from the US. It's very strongly driven nowadays by whether you're Democrat or Republican, and you follow that or that. And are consistent with, yeah, the people around you. You live in a small town, you don't want to go against the grain, even if that's something you might find relevant, and especially for attitudes that are further away from you, that are not in your daily life you're confronted with, then yeah, it makes sense for you to think, if your colleagues, your neighbors all think the same thing, it makes sense for you to believe the same thing. And yeah, we see the same here in Europe, where we don't have this very strong history of two parties dominating this, at least in most countries, which is actually, I think, very good, because therefore people can still have a wider range of menu to choose from whenever they go to the polls.
Now you're also hinting on the topic of polarization. I think that Gita also already hinted on that. So what's your diagnosis on this? To what extent is our societies indeed becoming more and more polarized?
I should actually refer this to Gita, because our recommendation was heavily influenced by the very great summary that Gita wrote in preparation for our report. But I mean, the research we've done on this and looked into all the empirical evidence was exactly the same in a sense that there wasn't really this issue-driven polarization. It wasn't really that people disagreed highly on this is the right policy forward, this is the right policy forward, but really more on do they feel differently towards the other group. And I don't think this is only, I mean, we shouldn't only give politicians the fault or even many, I don't know, depends somewhat on the country, but also, of course, the social media environment, the media environment per se, where we see causal evidence that in social media, the more moralizing posts, the more out-group referencing posts are automatically augmented and shown to more people. That, of course, drives the perception of the fact that the other group is bad. And there are some good papers that really show if they show others, well, on the opinion, you're actually not that far away from each other. I mean, this is the true evidence, then they're willing to also listen to the others more. And we should engage more into this of showing, well, actually, we're not that far away from each other.
There's a question from the audience by David Vos. Look, you can.
Thank you very much, Tim. On issue polarization, it seems to me that it can be decomposed into two parts. There's facts and values, and you can disagree about one or the other, or indeed both. You have places like the United States that's been mentioned that seems, and this is something our Dutch friends will recognize, is now virtually pillarized. That is, people, depending on which camp they're in, will have their own sources of media, their own schools, sets of friends, and so on. And within those spheres, it's not only values, but even the facts that seem to differ. It's tempting to suppose that a lot of debates are over values when actually frequently they're about facts. And I think Brexit was actually an example of that. That was certainly the most highly polarized debates that I can ever remember in Britain. And it was a confused mixture of disagreement over facts and values, but a large part of the story is that a lot of people had a very poor grasp of facts. So some of it had to do with values of nationalism versus internationalism, for example, but an awful lot of it was about what the actual consequences of leaving the European Union would be. And I think most of us in this room would probably agree that a lot of people just got it wrong there, but they got it wrong because they had relatively poor information, and an awful lot of the problems around polarization strike me as being essentially issues of fact rather than value. I mean, the most extreme case in the current period is possibly the Ukraine situation, where in Russia, clearly people are being given a kind of alternative reality through television in particular, that bears very little connection with what's actually happening. So I just throw that over to Kita and Mario and Tom to advise us on how this problem of facts as well as values can be recognized when it comes to polarization. Thanks.
I think I want to take this first, because there are two angles to this, and one slide I had on this issue when I talked about the my side bias. And I think on polarized issues, it's actually more often about the values or the specific attitudes that people hold strongly than about the facts. An example of a recent study where they looked at several statements made by the former US President Trump that were wrong. They went to a representative sample of the US and then corrected those and said, well, this is actually, that's correct and that was not correct. And they showed that the factual belief changed. So even among the supporters of Donald Trump, they showed, well, people adjusted their beliefs and then they believed the corrected one. But when they measured then the attitudes, they didn't change at all. Meaning that in this case, on these specific facts, and I think they were around immigration, there, it really was the attitude or the value behind, it was not the fact. But very importantly, one thing that Mark Ferguson was the chief science advisor of Ireland for 10 years, said was, if I talk something completely absurd about the Higgs boson, and I'm on national television for 2 hours and I do this, I will likely not get a shitstorm. Likely people will say, oh, that was a fantastic presentation. And it's okay. So he shouldn't do that, obviously, but he could. And the point was, if it's on already a polarized topic, then it's likely more about the values than about the facts. But if it's something else, your new facts might still win you in one way or the other. I hope that answers it a bit.
Yeah, just to add something to the discussion as well, because so obviously facts are important. If we could, have the same facts in everyone's mind, discussions would be a lot easier. But I think it's what is definitely also as important is how people perceive the situation, no matter what the facts are. If I currently live in a village on the countryside or in a neighborhood in the city, and I've seen my neighborhood changing over the last 10 years, people don't feel maybe at home anymore in their own neighborhood. When they've seen the doctor leaving the village, when they've seen public administration leaving the village, government. Public administration is something then digital and far away. They don't see, there's no police officer anymore. There's no police, how do you call it? It's not an agency, a police station anymore. And then, indeed, social media was mentioned already. That on social media, everyone has a fantastic life. The only one who doesn't have a fantastic life is, it's yourself. Then combine it with fake news, and then combine it with political parties that make this distrust and polarization as some kind of political business model. So we currently have a really poisonous cocktail of a situation where a lot of people are disappointed or feel left behind, geared by social media, fake news, and a political environment. And that's something we should be very well aware of, and that's a challenge as well to cope with that.
Yeah, and maybe one thing to add, also I just mentioned this press freedom index, and one of the reasons why that many countries actually decrease in, let's say, the freedom of their press was also because they saw an very intense increase in opinion media. So a lot of, so that the goal of media is not only to explore what is really happening or what are the details of this event, but also to get people's opinion on this. And this again also triggers identities, for example. If you see someone who's part of your in-group, for example, that has a certain opinion, instead of stating facts, you are more likely also to adopt this opinion as well. So this rise in opinion media instead of getting through the facts really is also a concern of this free press index.
Yep. You mentioned that people might feel threatened because they have changed. They've seen their neighborhoods change in the past decades, and also Luc during his presentation about the topic of migration mentioned that migration might have been a trigger or might have been an incubator of changes in values. So these days, there's a lot of talk about, a lot of questions about, okay, what might actually drive values change? People like Ronald Inglehart, for instance, talked about the dawn of the artificial intelligence society, where people's job, everyone's job might be at risk because of technological innovations. What do you think might be the biggest threats, the biggest challenges actually for the years ahead? And often the focus is on young people. How can we keep young people still involved in the process of politics? So maybe there are two questions. So what might be the biggest challenges in the years ahead? And how can we keep young people involved in politics? Who'd like to go first?
I will go first.
Okay.
I thought some of the things that we heard a lot already today is, for example, the focus on the future or the insecurity about where we go as a society or as a country actually, or as Europe. And that this is one major point that I see in a lot of, let's say, side or sub-themes. So this insecurity about what is coming and where we are going, what the future looks like for people, and especially what their place is in this future. So, for example, in my own research, I investigate lower and higher educated, and I see if they are polarizing. And in the qualitative research, I asked, like, what are the biggest differences between these groups, between the lower and the higher educated? And then they focus a lot on, you actually mentioned it as well in the presentation, on intelligence. So they say these higher educated, they are so intelligent, they know everything, and this is also how they behave towards us. So a lot of lower educated say this. They feel that they are better than us and that they have a place in this society that is becoming more complicated. And we actually also have this place. We do a lot of important work. A lower educated say this. We actually may be doing the most important work. We also saw it in the corona crisis, like the most important, the crucial jobs that we at least named them in the Netherlands, were actually somewhat lower educated jobs. And I think that one of the reasons why this polarization, or maybe what is like a threat to the future, is that people don't know exactly what their place is in the future, or that they feel that they are not recognized in, or their place is not recognized or valued in what is yet to come. That is at least one big issue for the future, I think.
Perhaps I can add one point that is very salient in connection with the social media transition, or the media transition in general that we have. And that is that we see evidence that, I mean, the young aren't disconnecting from these issues. It's not like all of a sudden young people don't care about it anymore. They actually do. But what we see is a lot that they're kind of in this doom scrolling mode. You know, there's always something going on. There's always a push message on something else, and they're engaging with this more on a, one researcher calls this political hobbyism. So basically everyone knows what's going on, everyone sees the same headlines, but it's not that the in-depth knowledge is there. And that, of course, it invites more this identity of like, I'm for or against this because I know the headline, but I don't know exactly the details. And I think if we want to change this, then we need to make them able to understand what's going on. That means also being transparent, of course, and being communicating properly what is developed, why is it developed this way, and why is the policy designed this way, and not assuming that they should know it just because it's there.
So that's clear advice to politics. So what can politicians do? What can politics do?
Well, answer questions. That's always good to for Poles. You know, what I wanted to add to the discussion is, you know, how to make sure that people are involved or feel involved. I'm not sure, but I have a room full of scholars that can prove me wrong. But I always tend to believe that people are not necessarily wanting to be involved in everything. I mean, they want to be represented, they want to trust, you know, I pick you once every 4 years and please solve everything and don't bother me with it because I'm bothering with, you know, providing for my family, let my kids grow up, etc. Now with the younger generation, I do see a lot of commitment. You know, we have these, especially on climate change, the Fridays for Futures, etc. But I think, I tend to believe that they're not necessarily trying to be involved in politics a lot, but what I see, especially on the business side, they're really involved at the moment. An example, before I became a member of parliament, I worked for one of the big 4 consultancy companies on sustainability and responsible government. And then you saw the change in applications. So our colleagues from the consultants and the deals department, etc., they saw applicants go down. So on one position there were 10 applicants, and in our sustainability department it went up. We had for 2 positions we had 200 or 250 people. And when I talk to companies here as well or lobbyists, etc., I always ask questions. So how do you attract talent? I mean, at the moment, in every conversation a company has with someone to get into the business, into the job, they get questions back. Okay, so now we've talked salary, etc. But so what's your mission? If I start working here, what do I do for society? And that's a big change as well, and a change I very much welcome, because as politicians we're also limited in the change we can bring to society, and especially when it comes to sustainability, etc. It's a lot of companies and businesses that really drive the change. And there you see young people be more involved all the time. And that's something I really much welcome. Yeah. It's not an answer to your question, but...
Well taken. One of the final topics I would like to discuss is about value diversity within Europe. As we do diagnose that the eastern part of Europe, and not every country, not all politicians across Europe, they do share the same values. Basically, there was some controversy about law and order in Poland, in Hungary. To what extent to what extent do you share actually this problem? Is this a problem? And to what extent do you also see that some turmoil, like the Ukraine war, actually facilitates integration of these countries in the European Union? Or to what extent, or what kind of action should be taken for stronger cultural integration of some countries?
Well, I'm not sure whether we should pursue cultural integration. I think what is most important is that we are, as a European Union, also a community of values, which means we have a baseline, a red line when it comes to certain values, when it comes to the rule of law, when it comes to freedom of press, etc. And that's where we need to act. Everything above that is also something that we should communicate on together. We should be in touch with each other. But yeah, we are united in diversity. And I'm always a bit... we should be, how do you say that? We should be conscious of, you know, everything the European Union does is Brussels decides something. And we should really find the balance between the speed of a country in certain direction or the cultural beliefs and what Brussels does to either like that or not.
But do you see in the European Parliament the crisis that we're currently facing, like COVID-19, where there was a lot of action between member states taking place, for instance, in the allocation of vaccines. Now with Ukraine, do you actually see some processes happening where things that were not taking place before?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a wide belief that there are certain challenges in our society, big challenge that we can only combat or work on together. Mm-hmm. But I must say, and I don't want to be too pessimistic, but what I mostly see in the European Parliament is everyone seeing proof of their already existing agenda in the current situation, no matter what the agenda was. So that's not a positive story, but yeah.
Perhaps positive. I don't know if it's positive, but at least that's my understanding of this united in diversity. If you remember back to the presentation on the values model or the values infographic that I showed, these were all positive things. So they were all about equality, taking care of nature, but also security, valuing some cohesion, but also being able to improve ourselves. These are values where I think diversity over those in terms of priorities is warranted and something we should be taken care of. It doesn't mean diversity in values of how this is politically implemented. So it doesn't mean that chaos is the right way to this, but so we should take the positive values into account, either through the model that we presented, or there's much other good research on this. But not necessarily then say, well, how we get there is irrelevant. We have a clear mandate on the EU values. We heard it, and how to implement this is important. And to uphold this, I think sometimes, I showed a graphic where the EU values were, at least in the perception of people, this is not any legal analysis, there's no structural analysis, it's purely how people saw this. Then you think about, how does this matter for those who are not supporting this? And how can we better explain that their interests and values and motivations are served by this? And if we lose that understanding, then that's the end to something that we don't want.
Indeed, so there's a lot of insights from values research, and you also did your own research, and I think we're coming close to an end. I think we should talk a little bit about this thing, the Atlas of European Values and European Value Study. One of the most interesting interviews I read that Mark actually conducted was with Nathalie Heinig, who actually says she's an expert of social identities, and she basically said, well, if you really want to measure identities, surveys are not the best way to go. So a bit of a question to you. What are the benefits and the drawbacks of studies like these? Quantitative, cross-national surveys.
Perhaps here I should reveal my true background. No, absolutely not. I'm an economist by training and with the behavioral economics focus, and I think there's a great value in this in conjunction with other methods as well. So I'm agreeing with the somewhat of a criticism. Of course, asking attitude questions alone won't get you always the answer that you want. And we know, framing of the question influences somewhat the answers. And of course, there's some change over time. So you need to do this a lot of times. But it's important to get an overview in the first instance. Without a representative quantitative overview of something like this on values, on attitudes, how would you make the decisions? The gut feeling is good, but we want to know where the whole population stands, and we cannot ask them each individually. But what we can do is, on top of that, do the engagement exercises. Do go deeper and say, okay, why do you think this? Why is this true to you? And what would you see as a solution to this? And I think, this combination of having this broad overview and this atlas, and then going deeper and doing qualitative studies, doing interviews, doing this group settings, and then field trials, controlled field trials, as the behavioral economists would say, to really show causality behind something. That would be the great conclusion to finding out really what matters, why, and then how much.
I also think that the topic of polarization is the perfect example of this, so that actually we are now in the state of we have established that issue polarization, like Mario explained, is not that much happening. It's not as extreme as people might think, and it was perfect to explain this by quantitative research, like survey methods. But we still have the idea, and we also see that people have the perception and the feeling that polarization is increasing. And if we want to understand that better, then it's actually a good. It's actually good. I don't know. I think my voice is loud enough for people to hear. But for YouTube, okay. Yes, YouTube-wise, this is better.
I'm just wondering if there are some issues with the microphones, that's all.
Or maybe I'm moving too much. Yeah, okay, I will keep it closer. I'm sorry. Quantitative research for kind of establishing, for example, the extent of polarization, but we see a more subjective indicators of subjective feelings of what is happening in the world are very well investigated by qualitative research and asking people what they see, what their perceptions actually mean, and why these feelings are there.
One final question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was intrigued by these remarks about polarization. And one aspect which we haven't yet discussed, if I recall correctly, is of course how it's played out in various political systems. Because you can have polarization, and you were already referring to Brexit and the Brexit referendum. If you have a situation that, like with the Brexit referendum, you can have polarization, but if 52% of the population, of the voting population, is enough to make the final decision on such a matter as being member of the European Union, then it's quite tricky. And why I'm saying this, because we were all concerned about the French elections, certainly also here in Brussels. And when you look at the numbers, when the party of Le Pen, her father, started in the first time they participated in the elections, that was 20 years ago in 2002, then they had 18%. Now, 5 years ago, I think it was something like 34%. Now it's 42%, so 8 percentage points extra. Well, compared to well, these were numbers, yeah, the official numbers all have. So 42%, another 8%, and you are very close to 50%. So so you can have polarization in a country, but how it's played out, and perhaps this is an interesting question for you, Mario, is that in Germany, this could never happen because you have a system of proportional representation, and you cannot have the situation that the most important politician in France is, of course, the president of the country, your country, the Bundeskanzler. Shouldn't we be worried because of this? Because polarization at the same level can be played out very differently in different countries due to the difference in political systems, electoral systems.
Perhaps I'm not the best to answer on this, but I think I have two important points that I want to make. On the one hand, we tried to investigate actually for the report, are certain electoral systems better in terms of having a lower polarization? And we didn't find consistent evidence that this is the case. So somewhat counterintuitive or surprising to us at least, there wasn't, okay, if you have multiple parties that make the threshold versus a presidential system versus two parties setting up, squaring off against each other, there wasn't a consistent less polarization effect. However, and that's something that's extremely important if you, for example, look into the US, is a social identity perspective. It means that in the US, okay, so think about it, you are part of the Republican Party for, let's say, because you like the economic policy that they do. Because we want to have this consistent view of ourselves as an identity, we also then will take over time the attitudes towards the social policies that they are proposing. Meaning, because you want to be consistent, and they propose this all the time, so over time we get this kind of consistencies on both sides on the whole spectrum, which normally we wouldn't have, and that we don't have, for example, in Germany, where if you are economically on the one side, but on the social policy on the other side, you have multiple parties to choose from, and you don't find this then anymore. So I think there is some good news in terms of you have less internal consistency when you have multiple parties, and that allows you for the change over time and having common ground with others more. But on the other hand, we don't see that the level of polarization per se, and I guess it's the effective polarization, is lower in these countries at the moment.
I hope that answers your question. Yeah, I was looking at my clock because I do know that Tom is constrained in time and that he needs to give a talk at 5 p.m. So we really want to ask a final question. And this is indeed, the Atlas has been released today. It's based on data of 2017 and some ongoing years. In a few years' time, there will be new data collection taking place. And we are talking now a lot about polarization, but what do you think might be in the next atlas? What kind of major trends might we actually see? Or should we talk about, should we write about in the next atlas of European values? Give us some homework to do. What topic should we focus on? Use the crystal ball.
Well, as I said in the very beginning, I think one of the major challenges at the moment are the haves and the have-nots, people that are disappointed. And I would really like to understand that situation better, and if more on that could be in the Atlas of European Values throughout Europe, so we understand things better as well. For me, it would be very helpful and insightful.
I would like to focus more on a common identity. So it's actually kind of going back to what the European Value Study first came from. So see if there's a collective identity kind of after religion, let's say, or is this kind of a new religion that we have to create? It doesn't have to be religion per se as we understand it, but what is kind of a new identity that binds us? It could also be European identity or another kind of belief that we have that binds us together and also gives people a sense of belonging and a goal for their life.
Perhaps as a last part, and it's difficult to do this, but I think what we see a lot here is a great overview of these are all these attitudes towards all these broad range of issues. One thing that's then always coming to my mind is why is that the case? And of course, it's part of research to then find the other variables and do some magic and statistics to find this out. But of course, you can also do a little bit more of these vignette studies, for example, to think about if we change one or two things around a certain perspective, or in a policy proposal, if we add or the subject around something, then do we change their opinions towards this? Because that could be a great way of finding common grounds. Because at the moment, very often you have, okay, 52% are for this or 60% for that. But if you want to find something that binds us back together and reduces polarization, we need to know what proposals could get everyone to agree with. So perhaps some vignette studies and variation could be good.
Thank you, Mario, Gita, and Tom. Dankjewel. Ja, je moet...
Een hele stapel.
Tuurlijk. Kun je een beetje uitdelen, man?
Ja, dank.
Inderdaad. So we're at the final part actually of today, and if correct, we have a live connection with Tanja Hristova, who's a member of the European Committee of the Regions, and we asked her for some closing remarks on European values and how to close the gap between politics and citizens. So I hope we can zoom in to. Hi, Tanja. We cannot hear you. Can you try? No. So no sound? No. No. Well, before we talked about still the technology these days, and that in the end everything will be fine, will turn out great. Yeah, it might be one of those days that it's a bit of an outlier in this whole debate. I really want to thank Bruno and his colleague, by the way, for directing, for bringing us all really good pictures. I really saw really nice footage. Thank you all for that. Yeah, maybe I should close then for today's session. So I'm really apologize for Ms. Hristova, because in the end maybe we give it a final try. One final try. No, it's not going to work out. It is what it is. But indeed, it's the end of the first day of the conference. Some of you are going to join us in Tilburg. You're all going to receive the Atlas tomorrow in your conference tote bag. Yeah, I know it's very hard, but you know what? If you open the website valuesatlas.eu, if you watch it, if you read it before you go to bed, you will dream of it, and all these magical maps will appear in your dreams. So. Exactly. So indeed, that's also something that Luc is saying. At the end, we want you have a fresh tomorrow morning, fresh at the conference. And if you're going to dream about all these numbers, about all these maps, then then maybe it's not a very great thing tonight. Anyway, so it's the end of today's session. I think we had a very good discussion about politics, about values. About the Atlas itself, very good overview about what we can do with the Atlas, how we can reach out with the information of the Atlas, for instance, the eValue project that Inge presented, or the Jean Monnet Center of Values, Jean Monnet Center of Excellence of European Values, that we are also going to talk about on Wednesday. I think these are really good initiatives that are taking place. But of course, all national teams that are also represented over here, like the Italian team, the Spanish team, Bulgarian team, I think they all make good use to the European Value Study. They contribute well, and I think in the next few days we will have the scientific discussion of research findings. The next 2 days, tomorrow, on Wednesday, we'll continue the debate. What we're going to do now is going for drinks, and also going for dinner, and then we will take the bus to magical Tilburg. Thank you all. Is Tanya there? Shall we give it a final try?
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Amazing, thank you. Hi.
So I apologize for this problem, but I have to confess that I did nothing. So a miracle probably happened.
It's fine. Thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Just to say and to address all of you that it is really a great honor for me to be part of this very interesting conference dedicated on the European values, especially today when we celebrate our shared values, our unity, our freedom, and our solidarity. On a day like this, we have to also remember that there were times that before no European Union exists, and especially in these turbulent periods that we are going through, we have to be very careful with our European identity and to try our best, especially the people engaged in politics, to make so that our citizens are really part of taking good decisions for the future of our European Union. As I was introduced by the moderator, just a short presentation of me. My name is Tanya Hristova, and I'm the mayor of Gabrovo municipality. This is a municipality in Bulgaria. Probably some of you have been to my country. It is located in the central part at the mountain foot, Stara Planina. And I'm also a member of the European Committee of the Regions. It seems that during these challenging times, we realize better the importance of strong European democracies, which are built on solid European values. And in this case, the local and regional leaders and the local and regional authorities play a vital role in promoting European values and encouraging citizens' participation in the democratic processes. These are really crucial for countering the multiplying threats which are present to our democracy and should be an essential element of education for all European citizens, a topic that I would like to focus during my intervention. This was also recently debated in the Committee of the Regions. And in the last session, we had the pleasure to get acquainted with the Atlas of the European Values, a project that is really very interesting and very good instrument that could be used by all European educational institutions. The European democratic values can be promoted in education in a bottom-up manner, of course, with full respect to the subsidiarity. I would like to share with you a project that was launched by the European Committee of the Regions, which presented on the internet site of the committee and interesting good practices that could be consulted. Our next step will be to develop the project and to establish a kind of a community of good practices. And the idea is to work towards shared pedagogical materials in a bottom-up approach. Recently, the European Parliament has also adopted the resolution on implementation of citizens' education, which calls for joint action to advance citizenship education and the teaching of common European values, which has to be translated into concrete and, I would say, interesting and involving initiatives, and to have clear objectives, targets, and to consider that citizens' education policy are really suffering from the implementation gap where we can and where we have to focus our attention. If we look on the list of the draft proposals put forward to the final deliberation within the Conference of the Future of Europe, we will see that there are several proposals highlighting the need of making European values tangible for the European citizens through more interactive and more direct involvement and increasing citizens' participation, and very importantly, to make so that young people are really engaged in our democratic initiatives, of course, based on the European democratic values. It is also proposed to develop future-proof education and lifelong learning in Europe, and to guarantee a minimum level of education across the European Union, and to involve the democratic processes, part of which is to be seen in teaching history of European integration and European citizenship, programs that could be drafted in accordance with the profile of the different ages. It is also suggested to offer young people more possibilities and existing programs for participation and representation in the democratic and decision-making processes at all levels, including also organizing different panels between citizens with the engagement of children, for example, in the area of schools. I have to assure all of you that these initiatives are very strongly supported by the Committee of the Region delegations and the local and regional authorities which participate in the Conference on the Future of Europe, highlighted very strongly the need for a European curriculum for civic education, which includes the promotion of European values, critical thinking, media literacy, and knowledge about European Union. I have to mention also that already in 2017, the Committee of the Regions endorsed the opinion on strengthening the European identity through education and culture, an opinion of which I have the privilege to be the rapporteur. In this opinion, the committee supported the general vision of European education area and agreed that the education and culture are major factors in making Europe more resilient in the context of accelerating globalization and current geopolitical trends. It also suggested that the level of governments which are in charge of setting the education curriculum for schools place additional focus on cultural and ethnographic aspects of history with a critical and philosophical analysis of universal values within diversity, and also include a section in the curriculum on the European Union. We also called for topics relevant to the digitalization of society to be given really greater prominence in order to introduce competencies not only pragmatic but also ethical, critical, and analytical in the field of cybersecurity, social networking, and media literacy. Let me share with you my strong conviction that now more than ever, education and culture could play a crucial role in bringing Europeans together. We need to rediscover and strengthen the ties between and within our societies. Undoubtedly, culture and education, which are sources of knowledge and mutual understanding, have the potential to be one of the driving forces in this process by fostering a sense of belonging to our common European project. I believe that education and culture should be enhanced Europe-wide and assumed as a productive tool which is instrumental for democracy and transparency, social and economic benefits, access and participation, respect for identity and diversity, and of course, intercultural dialogue and cultural rights. Therefore, on the one hand, we have to increase the understanding of our common heritage, and on the other, to try to raise awareness of the cultural diversity of our union. For this reason, I would like to highlight and to emphasize the importance of providing inclusive education for every learner in all learning environments and in a lifelong perspective, ensuring that every European citizen has the right to acquire social, civic, and intercultural competencies by promoting democratic values and fundamental rights, social inclusion and non-discrimination, as well as active citizenship and intercultural dialogue. This belief, I think, goes quite well with part of the debate in the previous dialogue, which was really very interesting to listen to. Education, therefore, is of strategic importance for our societies and economic development. I believe we will all agree that Europe's prosperity and way of life are really based about and on our greatest asset, which are the people and the human capital of Europe. I also believe that cultural heritage must be given a much bigger importance in educational activities, both formal and informal, and for all ages, in particular cross-sectoral approach and the identification of programs and actions to link the educational system to cultural heritage and creative sectors in this regard could be used as a very appropriate experiment. In this regard, greater synergetic relationship between education and culture would help to strengthen our European identity by promoting awareness about fundamental values of democracy, tolerance, intercultural competencies, critical thinking, media literacy, and cultural capabilities that will make European youth creative, critical, and of course, good citizens. I believe that the future of Europe rests largely on the shoulders of our youth, and therefore we also need to focus our efforts on the role of the young people as driving force for the future of our Europe. They must definitely, and this is lying on our shoulders, to be provided with right opportunities and be equipped with the necessary skills to become active and involved European citizens who can take control of their life and take the benefits of the advantages that has to be present for their future development. In conclusion, it is important to highlight that the European added value of education and culture as key policies with a broad mission for strengthening European identity, inclusiveness, and cohesion of our society should be taken on the agenda of our European development. At all levels, we should work for strengthening the democratic link between European Union and the citizens by ensuring that the Union provides effective and appropriate in-time solutions to the major challenges that cities, regions, and member states could not tackle by themselves, including also giving young people real perspectives for the future and for their education and professional realization. I believe that Europe needs to remain the continent that provides opportunities for an inclusive growth, a continent where technological development work at the service and at the interest of the human beings. Nevertheless, it is really crucial to work with the long-term vision, although we are living in a turbulent period when unexpected impacts happen. But we have to promote change in people behavior and feelings from local and bottom-up perspective, which for me, being a representative of the local authority, is very important. The various levels of governance, involve state, regions, and cities, are very key in unleashing the full potential of these factors that involve education and culture, and will allow to impact the strategic development of our European Union and be supportive for our economy and environment. With this, I would like to once again express my gratefulness for being a part of this very crucially important conference, and to wish success for the next days that will gather very interesting people debating different aspects of our common values in search of our European identity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your inspiring words, Tanya, and we're really looking forward to working together with you in the upcoming years. It was very clear that indeed from the eValue project being coordinated by Inge Sieber, that we've been in close contact with you at the European Committee of the Regions. We hope we hope to continue doing that in the years to come. Thank you so much. Again, I would like to end the conference today over here. Again, very much thank you, Rob, and your team for hosting us. Thank you, Bruno, and your team for doing all the footage, all the videos, and making sure that everything was really perfect in over YouTube. I think really got some good comments during the break. So thank you very much. And to all other participants, let's have a drink.